Every single day, we make hundreds of small, seemingly insignificant decisions. We choose what to eat for breakfast, what road to take on our commute, what book to read before bed, or whether to strike up a casual conversation with a stranger on the bus. Most of the time, these little choices fade into the background of our lives, completely forgotten by the time we wake up the next morning. But every once in a while, one of those tiny, routine decisions sets off a massive, unstoppable chain reaction. A single choice, made in a split second of boredom, desperation, or simple curiosity, can completely reshape a person's life forever. And sometimes it does not just change their own life, it changes the lives of millions and millions of other people all around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 normal, everyday people who found themselves standing at these exact crossroads. They made choices that felt completely ordinary at the time, but those decisions ended up sending shockwaves through history, pop culture, and global politics. Our first story begins on a cold, gray afternoon in the year 2009 inside a quiet, dimly lit manga cafe in the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea. A 38-year-old man named Hwang Dong-huk was sitting in a small, private wooden booth staring blankly at the wall. A manga cafe is a very popular place in South Korea where people can go to escape the noise and stress of the city. You can buy cheap snacks, sip on hot drinks, and browse through massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with thousands of manga volumes, which are essentially Japanese comic books. It is a place designed for quiet comfort and cheap relaxation, but on this particular day, Hwang Dong-hyuk was anything but relaxed. The truth was, he was completely broke. He did not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee or a small snack from the cafe counter. He had only come inside because it was a warm, quiet place to sit and escape the harsh, unforgiving reality of his daily life. At 38 years old, his life was in complete shambles. For his entire adult life, he had dreamed of becoming a successful writer and film director. He had spent years studying the craft, working long hours on various movie sets, and trying to get his scripts noticed by major production companies. He had successfully landed a few small temporary jobs here and there, writing a script or directing a minor project, but the entertainment industry in Seoul was incredibly competitive and unpredictable. Every single time he thought he was finally making progress, the project would suddenly fizzle out, the funding would dry up, and he would find himself right back where he started, completely unemployed. At this point in his life, he was completely out of options and drowning in debt. He lived in a tiny, cramped apartment with his elderly mother and his grandmother. Even though all 3 of them pooled every single penny they had, they still struggled to pay their monthly rent and keep the heating on. The financial stress was absolutely crushing, hanging over him like a dark cloud. Just a few weeks prior, Hwang had been forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. He had to sell his laptop, which was his most prized possession, and the only tool he had to write his scripts. He sold it for a fraction of what it was worth, just so his family would not get evicted onto the cold streets. To make matters worse, he had started taking out short-term, high-interest loans just to buy basic necessities like white rice and medicine. He had absolutely no way of paying them back, and the debt was piling up like a mountain, with predatory debt collectors constantly calling his phone. The anxiety was so intense that he could barely sleep. The only way he could find even a temporary moment of peace was to escape into the world of manga. So, on this afternoon, he went to the cafe's library shelves, searched through the volumes, and pulled down a copy of his absolute favorite manga series. It was a highly controversial and incredibly violent survival story called Battle Royale. The story follows a class of high school students who are forced by a ruthless authoritarian government to fight each other to the death on a deserted island until only one survivor remains. The manga was notorious for its graphic violence and dark psychological themes, but to Hwang it was a masterpiece. It was so over-the-top and dramatic that it allowed him to completely forget about his own miserable life, if only for an hour. As he sat in his booth, turning the pages and reading the story for the 20th time, a sudden thought struck him. He looked at the pages, showing characters fighting for survival, and then he thought about his own desperate situation. He thought about the crushing weight of his debt, the feeling of absolute hopelessness, and the sheer desperation that consumed him every single day. He realized that there were millions of people in South Korea and all over the world who were experiencing this exact same kind of financial desperation. And then he had a massive epiphany. What if he wrote a story that combined the extreme high-stakes survival elements of Battle Royale with the harsh modern reality of extreme poverty? He started thinking about his childhood, playing innocent street games like the Squid Game, Red Light, Green Light, and the Dalgona Candy Challenge with his friends. Back then, the only stakes were who got to be the king of the playground. But what if, instead of high school students forced to fight by a government, the story was about ordinary, deeply indebted adults who willingly signed up to play these innocent childhood games for a massive cash prize? They would know that losing meant death, but their real lives were already such a living hell that they were willing to take the risk. The idea was so brilliant and so raw that it made his hands shake. He did not have his laptop anymore, but he had a cheap pen and some scraps of paper. He leaned over the table in his booth and began to write furiously. He sketched out characters, came up with ideas for different games, and outlined a complex, dark narrative about human nature and greed. He wrote for hours and hours, completely losing track of time. By the time the cafe manager tapped on his shoulder to tell him they were closing, Hwang had a complete, detailed outline of a brand new world. Over the next several months, Hwang worked tirelessly to turn this outline into a full, polished script. He had to write much of it by hand on yellow legal pads, but he poured his entire soul into it. He was absolutely convinced that this script was his masterpiece, the one project that would finally pull his family out of poverty. But when he finally finished the script and began pitching it to investors and production studios, his dreams were completely shattered. Every single buyer he met with rejected it immediately. They told him the script was way too weird, far too dark, and completely unrealistic. They said that a story about desperate people murdering each other in children's games was too grotesque for television and that no mainstream audience would ever want to watch it. For 10 long years, Hwang Dong-hook carried that script with him everywhere he went. He remained broke, his family continued to struggle, and he was forced to take on low-paying menial jobs just to survive. He often had to skip meals, and the shame of being unable to support his mother and grandmother ate away at him. But despite all the rejections and the constant self-doubt, he refused to throw the script away. He knew in his gut that the story was powerful, and that people who had experienced real struggle would relate to the themes of desperation and survival. Then, fast forward to the year 2019. Out of nowhere, a major global production studio decided to take a massive gamble. They looked at Hwang's script and saw something unique. They bought the rights to the story and put it into production as a high-budget television series. 12 years after Hwang Dong-hyuk had sat in that manga cafe, broke and hopeless, his vision was finally brought to life. In September of 2021, the show premiered. Almost overnight, the series became a monumental global phenomenon. It completely dominated the internet, becoming the most-watched show in the history of the streaming platform. It sparked thousands of memes, merchandise lines, and discussions about economic inequality in modern society. The show ultimately generated over $900 million in value for the production company. And as for Hwang Dong-hook, his life was changed forever. He was finally able to pay off all his debts, buy a beautiful home for his mother and grandmother, and secure his place as one of the most respected writers and directors in the industry, even winning a prestigious Emmy Award for his direction. The manga series that started it all was Battle Royale, and the global phenomenon that Hwang created was called Squid Game. It all happened because a desperate man with no money in his pocket made the simple decision to walk into a cafe and read his favorite comic book. It is truly amazing how a single afternoon in a manga cafe could lead to one of the biggest television shows in human history. But now, let us travel back to a different time and place, to the hot summer of 1953 in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. Inside a small, unassuming brick building on Union Avenue, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was busy cleaning up his recording studio. The studio was called Sun Records, and it was Sam's pride and joy. Memphis was a city bursting with musical energy, a place where gospel, blues, country, and rhythm and blues were constantly blending together on the street corners and in the local clubs. Sam was a deeply passionate music lover who believed that the big, established record labels in New York and Los Angeles were completely out of touch with the raw, authentic music of the American South. He wanted to capture that raw energy, but he did not have the money or the connections to sign big-name acts. So, Sam came up with a very unique and highly unusual business model. He decided to open up his recording studio to absolutely anyone who walked off the street. He set up a policy where anyone could walk into Sun Records at any time, hand him exactly $4, and in exchange, Sam would record them professionally and press their song onto a double-sided acetate disc. Sam hoped that by casting such a wide net, he would eventually find a rare, undiscovered talent, a star that could put his studio on the map. But the reality of this business model was incredibly grueling. Most of the people who paid the $4 were not talented at all. They were amateur singers who sang completely out of key, played their instruments poorly, and left Sam sitting in the control room with a massive headache. On this particular summer afternoon, Sam had just finished recording a local church choir, which had gone reasonably well, and now he was sweeping up the dust, wrapping up heavy microphone cables, and resetting his recording equipment, hoping that someone interesting would walk through the door. And then, the door opened, and an 18-year-old kid walked inside. The kid was dressed in simple work clothes, covered in grease and sweat from his day job, and he had a cheap acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was incredibly shy. He stood near the entrance, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, barely making eye contact with Sam. The young man walked up to the reception desk and met Sam's assistant, a woman named Marion Keisker. She asked him what kind of singer he was, and the kid replied that he sang all kinds. When she asked who he sounded like, he famously looked down and said that he did not sound like nobody. Sam greeted him warmly and asked how he could help him. The young man cleared his throat and explained in a very soft, polite voice that he worked as a truck driver for a local electrical supply company called Crown Electric. He said that he loved to play the guitar and sing in his spare time, and that he wanted to use the $4 service to record a couple of traditional, slow ballads as a birthday gift for his beloved mother, Gladys. Sam, always welcoming, smiled and told him to step right into the recording booth. The kid handed over his $4, walked into the small booth, and positioned himself in front of the microphone. Sam went back into the control room, put on his headphones, and prepared himself for what he assumed would be a very average, mediocre performance. But the moment the kid struck the first chord on his guitar and began to sing, Sam's jaw practically hit the floor. The transformation was absolute. The incredibly shy, awkward teenager who had just been mumbling at the front door completely vanished. In his place was an artist of unbelievable depth and power. His voice was incredibly rich, warm, and filled with a deep, soulful emotion that seemed far beyond his 18 years. He sang the slow ballads with perfect control and a hauntingly beautiful tone that filled the entire studio. Sam sat in the control room, completely paralyzed, listening to this truck driver sing. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was listening to someone truly extraordinary. When the recording was finished, the young man stopped singing, and just like that, the magic vanished. He instantly reverted back to being a shy, polite teenager. He stepped out of the booth, thanked Sam quietly, took his newly pressed acetate disc, and walked out into the hot Memphis sun. Once the kid was gone, Sam sat in the silence of his studio, his heart racing. He reached for his notepad where he kept track of the people who came into the studio, and he wrote down a quick, urgent note to himself. It read, "Good ballad singer. Save." He knew he had to keep this kid in mind for the future. Fast forward to the summer of 1954, about a year after that fateful afternoon. Sam was back in the studio, working with a local country music band. They were trying to record a few tracks, but the session was going terribly. The band was talented, but they felt like their instrumental tracks were flat and lacked a strong, defining lead voice to pull everything together. They asked Sam if he knew of any vocalists in the area who might be able to help them. Sam's studio manager, who had been present during the young truck driver session the year before, immediately jumped in. She reminded Sam of the shy 18-year-old who had recorded the ballads for his mother, insisting that his voice was one of the best she had ever heard. Sam agreed and decided to give the young man a call. The kid was thrilled to get the invitation and rushed down to the studio to meet the band. But when they began to play, the session was a complete disaster. The young man was still a fantastic singer, but he and the band had absolutely no chemistry. They had just met, and they were trying to play standard, highly structured country and pop songs. The kid's slow, expressive ballad style did not fit the up-tempo, rigid rhythm of the band at all. It sounded stiff, awkward, and completely lifeless. Sam watched from the control room, feeling the tension rise. After several failed attempts, he could see that everyone was getting frustrated and tired. He decided to call for a quick break to let everyone clear their heads. The band members and the young singer put down their instruments and walked out of the live room to grab a cold drink and step outside. Sam walked into the adjacent control room to sit in silence and try to figure out how to salvage the session. The control room did not have a window looking into the live booth, so he was completely cut off from seeing what was happening in there. But then, through the heavy walls of the studio, Sam heard a faint sound. It turns out that the young singer had gone back into the recording booth alone while the band was still outside. He had picked up his acoustic guitar and started playing an old blues song called That's All Right, which had originally been recorded by an artist named Arthur Crudup. But the kid was not playing it like a traditional blues song. He was playing it incredibly fast, with a driving, bouncing, energetic rhythm that was completely unique. He was tapping on the wood of his guitar, creating a beat that made it impossible not to move. Hearing the upbeat noise, the band members ran back into the booth, grabbed their instruments, and began to play along with him, caught up in the pure, unadulterated joy of the sound. Sam stood up in the control room, his ears ringing with this incredible, loud, kinetic music. He ran out of the control room, threw open the door to the recording booth, and what he saw absolutely took his breath away. The shy, quiet truck driver was leaping around the room, totally lost in the rhythm, strumming his guitar with a wild, infectious energy. His voice was pouring out of him with a raw, electric power, a perfect blend of soulful blues and energetic country swing. It was a sound that Sam had never heard in his entire life, a completely new kind of music that defied any existing genre. Sam stood there with goosebumps covering his arms, realizing that this was the exact sound he had been searching for his entire life. He shouted to the band to keep playing exactly what they were playing, quickly turned on the recording equipment, and captured the track on tape that very night. When the song was played on a local Memphis radio station a few days later, the station was completely flooded with phone calls from listeners demanding to hear it again. The young truck driver became a sensation overnight, launching a career that would completely revolutionize the music industry and pop culture forever. The studio was Sun Records, and the young truck driver who spent $4 to record a song for his mother was none other than Elvis Presley, the future king of rock and roll. It is truly mind-blowing to think that the entire history of rock and roll was set in motion because a young man wanted to make a thoughtful birthday gift for his mother. But our third story takes us to a very different kind of arena, where a single, high-stakes decision in a boxing ring completely transformed a man's reputation and paved his way to leading an entire nation. Our story takes place on the evening of March 31st, 2012, in the city of Ottawa, Canada. Inside a massive, brightly lit convention center, a 40-year-old man named Justin was standing in the corner of a professional boxing ring. The arena was packed to the brim with hundreds of screaming spectators, and television cameras were swooping overhead, broadcasting the event to thousands of viewers across the country. Justin was incredibly nervous. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, and his hands were sweating inside his heavy boxing gloves. This was easily the most important athletic event of his life, but it was also, terrifyingly, the very first time he had ever stepped into a boxing ring for an actual fight. He was a complete amateur, and he knew that his entire reputation and future were on the line. The match was a highly publicized charity event called the Fight for the Cure, designed to raise funds for cancer research. But there was also a massive political rivalry at play. Justin was a young, ambitious member of parliament, and his opponent was a conservative senator. The fight was viewed by the media as a symbolic battle between two opposing political ideologies and personalities. It was a clash between the progressive, young liberal and the older, traditional conservative. Justin looked across the ring and locked eyes with his opponent. His opponent's name was Brass Knuckles Brazil, although his real name was Patrick Brazeau. He was a highly intimidating figure who had served in the Canadian military and held a black belt in karate. He was notorious for possessing an incredibly strong, bone-shattering punch, which is how he had earned the nickname Brass Knuckles Brazil. He was several pounds heavier than Justin, with broad shoulders and a reputation for raw physical aggression. During the pre-fight weigh-in, the contrast between the two men could not have been more obvious. Brass Knuckles Brazil stood there shirtless, showing off his muscular, tattooed physique, looking like a professional gladiator. Justin, on the other hand, looked lean and relatively average, leading the media and the public to completely write him off before the match even started. Almost everyone who was following the fight believed that Brass Knuckles Brazil was going to absolutely destroy Justin. And it was not just because of his opponent's military background and martial arts skills, but because of Justin's own public reputation. To the Canadian public, Justin was viewed as a soft, pampered, and incredibly privileged intellectual. He was the son of a highly famous former prime minister, and most people believed he had lived a life of luxury, completely insulated from any real physical hardship or conflict. He was seen as a lightweight, a handsome and charming man who lacked any real toughness or grit, often dismissed as a mere drama teacher who had stumbled into politics. The idea of him entering a boxing ring against a military veteran was seen as a joke. When Justin had first entered the ring that night, the sports announcers on television did not even try to hide their skepticism. They openly mocked his appearance, his fancy hair, and his bright red boxing trunks. They immediately gave him the mocking nickname of the Shiny Pony, laughing about how quickly he was going to get knocked out by a tough military veteran like Brass Knuckles Brazil. They predicted that the fight would not even last past the first round. But what the announcers and the public did not know was that the Shiny Pony had been training quietly and intensely for months. He had spent hours in local gyms, sweating, lifting weights, and practicing his punches, determined to prove to the world that he was much tougher than his pampered image suggested. He had learned how to take a punch, how to move his feet, and how to maintain his breathing under intense pressure. The bell rang for the first round, and the fight began. Justin, fueled by pure adrenaline, charged across the ring and immediately started throwing wild, heavy punches. But his technique was chaotic, and Brass Knuckles Brazil easily slipped and ducked away from every single blow. And then the counterattack came. Brass Knuckles Brazil stepped forward and began to pummel Justin with brutal, precise force. He landed heavy, painful punches to Justin's ribs, chest, and face. Justin's head snapped back under the impact of the blows, and he quickly found himself completely overwhelmed, bleeding from his nose and mouth, and desperately clinging to his opponent just to stay upright. The heavy gloves of the military veteran felt like blocks of cement hitting his jaw. The announcers on television were practically laughing, calling the match a complete slaughter and mocking Justin for ever thinking he could step into a ring with a real fighter. They commented that the Shiny Pony was about to be sent to the pasture. Justin was in absolute agony, his vision spinning, and he was on the absolute verge of falling to the canvas. His body wanted to give up, and his brain was telling him to lie down and let the pain stop. But right before Brass Knuckles Brazil could land a decisive knockout punch, the bell rang, signaling the end of the first round. Justin stumbled back to his corner, his legs shaking. The ringside medic immediately rushed in to clean the blood off his face, and his coach leaned in, shouting instructions and trying to get him to focus. But Justin could barely hear a word. His head was throbbing, and he was in deep physical shock. But amid all the pain and the roaring of the crowd, a clear, powerful realization came over him. He knew that if he quit now, or if he allowed himself to get easily knocked out in the second round, his public life would be completely over. He would permanently be branded as a joke, a weak, pampered coward who tried to act tough on national television and got humiliated. He knew that the only way to save his reputation was to fight with absolute, reckless abandon. He had to stop trying to box defensively and simply fight for his life. The bell rang for the second round. Justin stood up, wiped the blood from his eyes, and charged back out into the center of the ring. But this time, his energy was completely different. He was fast, relentless, and completely focused. He went straight at Brass Knuckles Brazil, throwing a rapid barrage of heavy punches. And to the absolute shock of everyone in the arena, his punches began to land. He struck Brass Knuckles Brazil with a series of powerful, stinging blows to the head and body. The military veteran was caught completely off guard, expecting Justin to be timid and defeated after the beating he had taken in the first round. Instead, he was facing a man who seemed completely possessed and utterly unafraid of pain. Justin kept moving forward, landing hit after hit, driving his opponent back against the ropes. He used his height advantage to keep the veteran at a distance, landing jab after jab with incredible accuracy. The crowd in the convention center erupted into a deafening roar. The sports announcers were in complete disbelief, shouting into their microphones as the shiny pony completely dominated the round. By the time the bell rang to end the second round, it was Brass Knuckles Brazil who was stumbling back to his corner, gasping for air and looking completely stunned. During the brief rest period, Justin stood in his corner, his chest heaving. He looked across the ring and saw that his opponent was avoiding his gaze, looking exhausted, defeated, and deeply shaken. Justin knew that he had won the mental battle. The bell rang for the third and final round. Justin did not hesitate for a second. He charged across the canvas and unleashed a brutal, unstoppable attack on Brass Knuckles Brazil, landing powerful punches to his face over and over again. Finally, Justin landed a massive, bone-crushing right hook directly to his opponent's nose. The impact was so severe that the man's nose completely shattered and blood began to pour down his face. The referee immediately stepped in, pushed Justin back, and stopped the fight. It was a technical knockout victory. The shiny pony had won the match. The arena went absolutely wild, and the victory became the single biggest news story in Canada the next day. While the fight was officially just a charity event to raise money, the true significance of the match was deeply political. Justin had taken a massive, incredibly risky gamble to completely redefine how the entire nation viewed him. By stepping into the ring against a highly formidable opponent, taking a brutal beating, and fighting his way to a dominant victory through sheer grit and determination, he completely shattered his image as a soft, pampered intellectual. The public now saw him as a tough, resilient, and charismatic fighter who was capable of standing his ground and overcoming impossible odds. They realized that he had played a brilliant strategic game, intentionally letting his opponent wear himself out in the first round before launching his own offensive. Justin used this incredible surge of national popularity and respect to launch a massive political campaign, eventually leading his party to a historic victory and getting elected as the Prime Minister of Canada. His full name is Justin Trudeau, and his opponent in that legendary match was Patrick Brazeau, referred to during the broadcast as Brass Knuckles Brazil. It all started because a man, nicknamed the Shiny Pony, decided to step into a boxing ring to prove to his country that he was a fighter. These three stories, as different as they are, all share a powerful and inspiring truth. They show us that our lives are not completely defined by our current circumstances, no matter how difficult, painful, or hopeless they might seem. A broke writer sitting in a quiet cafe with debt collectors calling his phone, a young truck driver who was far too shy to make eye contact with a stranger, and a politician openly mocked by his entire country as a pampered, weak, lightweight. None of them could have predicted where their simple choices would lead them on that day. but by choosing to take a chance, to step out of their comfort zones, and to push forward through the rejection, the physical pain, and the overwhelming doubt, they completely rewrote their destinies. Their decisions did not just change their own lives, they created iconic art, revolutionary music, and political history that will endure for generations to come. It is a powerful reminder that the smallest, most routine choices we make today might just be the very first step on a massive journey that changes everything. We should never underestimate the power of a single moment or a single decision to transform our world forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There's a quiet belief most of us carry without ever questioning it that the world makes sense. That everything has a cause, an explanation waiting somewhere if we look hard enough. But every so often, a story appears that doesn't just challenge that belief, it destroys it. These aren't just strange accidents. These are moments where reality itself seems to fracture, where experienced men, people who knew the wilderness better than most, suddenly face something they couldn't explain, couldn't fight, and couldn't even see. Because the truth is, the natural world has never really belonged to us. We map it, name it, walk through it as if we're in control. But there are places, remote, silent, untouched, where that illusion falls apart. Places where the deeper you go, the more it feels like something else is watching, waiting. The three stories you're about to hear all begin in places that should feel familiar. A quiet forest. A frozen mountain. A remote campsite. Places people go to feel safe. But in each of these stories, that safety disappears. It's not just that something went wrong, it's that something was already there. Waiting. Watching. And at some point, it decided to make itself known. So don't just ask what happened. Ask yourself, what could cause it? Because maybe the most terrifying part isn't the mystery itself. It's the possibility that it isn't rare at all. The story of Carl Herrick is one of those mysteries that lingers in the minds of anyone who hears it, mostly because it defies everything we think we know about how the world works. On the 23rd of November 1943, the woods of West Townsend, Vermont were crisp and quiet. It was the kind of day that hunters dream of, cold, peaceful, and perfect for tracking deer. 37-year-old Carl Herrick was out in the wilderness with his cousin, Henry, hoping to bring something home. They knew the area well enough, but as the hours wore on and the sun began its slow descent, the two men somehow got separated. It was a common enough occurrence in the woods. You focus on the movement of a deer, the rustle of leaves, and suddenly the person you were walking with is no longer at your side. Henry, initially unconcerned, started calling out for Carl. He figured his cousin had probably just wandered off in a different direction to get a better vantage point, or had perhaps grown tired and decided to head back to the warmth of their base camp. Henry spent some time searching the immediate vicinity, his voice echoing through the rugged terrain, but there was no response. The silence of the Vermont wilderness can be heavy, but at that moment, it just felt empty. Eventually, Henry decided to head back to camp himself, assuming he would find Carl waiting there. When Henry arrived, the camp was completely deserted. The fire was cold, and the air felt still. He waited, minutes turning into an hour, and a slow, creeping dread began to settle in his chest. That sinking feeling, the one that tells you something has gone fundamentally wrong, took hold. Recognizing that this was no longer a simple case of a misplaced hunter, Henry hurried to alert the authorities. The search that followed was exhaustive. For 3 long days, search teams combed through the pristine, jagged wilderness of the Glastonbury area, a place that many locals whispered was part of the Bennington Triangle, a region with an unsettling reputation for disappearances and strange occurrences. They looked everywhere, but the woods were tight-lipped and revealed nothing. It wasn't until the third day that Henry himself stumbled upon his cousin. Carl Herrick was lying face down in a small clearing. At first, from a distance, it looked as though he might just be resting, perhaps injured or exhausted. Henry ran to him, his heart pounding, only to roll him over and realize that Carl was gone. There was no life left in him. What was most confusing, however, was the state of the body. There were no obvious, catastrophic injuries. Aside from some minor scratches on his hands and arms, Carl looked almost untouched. And yet, the official report revealed a horrifying reality. Carl had been squeezed to death. The pressure exerted on his chest had been so immense that his ribs had been shattered and a bone had punctured his lung. The investigators were left with a puzzle they were determined to solve quickly. They pieced together the scene. They found Carl's rifle, fully loaded, leaning against a tree about 70 feet away. Right next to the rifle was a single expended shell casing. The theory that emerged was neat and clinical. Carl had been hunting, encountered a black bear, and fired a single shot. Believing he had downed the animal, he had set his gun down, walked over to check his prize, and was then ambushed by the bear, which had been hiding and waiting. In its final desperate act, the beast had crushed him. But as the days passed, the story stopped making sense to those who looked closer. If Carl was an experienced hunter, which he was, he would know that one shot, especially from a standard hunting rifle, rarely stops a black bear in its tracks. He wouldn't have just put his weapon against a tree and walked 70 feet away, effectively making himself defenseless. And even if we assume he did make that fatal error, there is the matter of the bear itself. Black bears do not kill by squeezing. They maul, they bite, and they swipe. They tear through their prey. There were no signs of a savage mauling on Carl's body, only the internal trauma of being compressed. It remains one of the great mysteries of the Bennington Triangle. If it wasn't a bear, and everything about the evidence suggests it couldn't have been, then what was it? What kind of creature has the strength to snap a man's ribs without shredding his skin, and what was it doing in those woods in the fall of 1943? People still talk about the Bennington Monster, a towering 8-foot-tall creature that is said to haunt the mountains of Glastonbury. Whether that is just a local legend or the shadow of something much more terrifying, we may never know. For now, the story of Carl Herrick remains a chilling reminder that there are still corners of the wild that we do not fully understand, and perhaps some things are better left undiscovered. And just when it seems like the forest has already shown us the worst it can do, another story reminds us that it's not just the woods that hide the unknown. Because far from the dense trees of Vermont, high above the world in the frozen silence of a mountain, something else was waiting. Something that didn't need to leave a body behind to prove it was there. The slopes of Mount St. Helens in 1950 were a world away from the noise and complication of modern life. For Jim Carter, a man defined by his passion for the outdoors and his precision behind a camera lens, the mountain was a sanctuary of frozen grandeur. He was not a casual visitor. He was an expert skier. Someone who understood the temperament of the snow and the rhythm of the high alpine terrain. He moved with a grace that only those who have spent their lives in the mountains possess. On that clear, crisp day in 1950, surrounded by a group of fellow enthusiasts, Jim was in his element. The morning had been perfect, with the snow glistening like a vast field of crushed diamonds under the bright winter sun. As the group made their way toward a scenic ridge, the light shifted, casting long, dramatic shadows across the snow. It was exactly the kind of lighting Jim lived for. He stopped his companions, signaling that he needed a moment to set up his camera. He wanted to capture the sheer scale of the peak, the way the sky met the jagged horizon. It was a routine pause in an otherwise ordinary day, and his friends, accustomed to his artistic focus, skied ahead a few hundred yards to wait. They stood there, enjoying the crisp air and the profound silence that only high altitudes can provide, expecting to hear the satisfying click of his camera shutter at any moment. But the silence stretched on, becoming heavy and unnatural. Minutes turned into nearly an hour, and when they finally turned back to look for him, the slope where they had left him was empty. There was no sign of the tripod, no sign of his gear, and no sign of Jim. At first, there was no panic. They assumed he had simply changed his mind and taken a different route, or perhaps he had wandered off to chase a better shot elsewhere. They shouted his name, their voices muffled by the vastness of the mountain. They skied back and forth, tracing the edges of the terrain, expecting to see his familiar silhouette cresting a nearby ridge at any moment. But as the sun began to dip toward the jagged tree line, the reality of the situation began to set in. Jim was gone. The official search began the following morning, a massive, coordinated effort involving seasoned mountain rescuers, local authorities, and volunteers who knew the mountain like the back of their hands. They were prepared for the worst, a fall, a broken leg, or a disorienting whiteout. But what they found instead was something that defied all logical explanation and chilled the rescue team to their cores. They eventually picked up Jim's ski tracks. They were clear, deep, and remarkably purposeful. He had not been skiing casually. He had been moving at a frantic, breakneck speed. The trajectory was unmistakable. He had been traveling in a dead straight line, heading directly toward the notoriously dangerous, jagged expanse known as Ape Canyon. As the searchers followed the path, they saw evidence that pushed the limits of human capability. Jim had encountered several deep, treacherous ice crevasses along his path gaps that would normally force any skier to stop, scout, and detour. Instead of stopping, Jim had launched himself over them. The distance of these jumps was staggering, requiring not just immense physical strength and perfect timing, but a complete disregard for self-preservation. It was the movement of a man driven by sheer, unadulterated terror, someone running from something, or someone that they were convinced was right at their heels. The tracks led them to the very lip of Ape Canyon, a place where the mountain seemed to split open into a dark, unforgiving abyss. The tracks stopped abruptly at the edge. There was no sign of a return path, no evidence of a slip, and certainly no sign that he had attempted to turn back. It was as if he had simply arrived at the edge and ceased to exist. For 10 days, the search effort continued with an intensity that was almost desperate. They probed the canyon floor, they rappelled down the icy walls, and they used every piece of equipment available at the time to scan the deep, snow-packed crevices. They found nothing. There was no glove, no piece of his clothing, no fragment of his camera equipment. It was as if the mountain itself had opened up to claim him and then sealed itself shut, leaving not a single trace to suggest he had ever been there. The disappearance of Jim Carter remains one of the most unsettling mysteries in the history of the Pacific Northwest. In the years since, theories have been whispered in lodges and mountain cabins. Some speak of mountain predators, others of the unexplained phenomena that have long been rumored to occur in the shadows of Mount St. Helens. But those who stood on that ridge, who looked at the tracks of a man who had leaped over death itself, know that the truth is likely far stranger than any legend. Jim Carter, an expert, a photographer, and a lover of the wild, left a story that persists precisely because it lacks an ending. He left behind a path that points toward a place that does not want to be explored, and a question that continues to haunt every person who ventures into the high, lonely places of the world. What could have terrified an expert to the point of such suicidal speed? What, in the quiet, frozen heart of the mountain, was waiting for him? The tracks end at the canyon's edge, but the mystery continues to ripple outward, a permanent, freezing reminder that there are still parts of this earth that remain utterly beyond our grasp, keeping their secrets in the dark, silent ice. If the mountain could erase a man without leaving behind a single trace, then then what happened next suggests something even more disturbing, that sometimes whatever is out there doesn't just watch from a distance. Sometimes it comes closer, close enough to be heard, close enough to surround you in the dark. Based on the 1971 Sierra Camp encounter involving Ron Moorhead and his hunting companions, here is the story rewritten in accessible narrative English. The year was 1971. For Ron Moorhead and 3 of his friends, the remote reaches of the Sierra Nevada mountains were meant to be a getaway, a chance to disconnect from the noise of modern life, enjoy the crisp mountain air, and perhaps secure a harvest for the season. They were seasoned outdoorsmen, familiar with the sounds and rhythms of the wilderness. They knew how to handle themselves in the dark, and they certainly weren't the type to be easily spooked by the rustle of a pine branch or the distant hoot of an owl. But on this particular trip, the wilderness felt different. The silence, usually a comforting blanket, began to feel heavy, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, watching them. It started on a cold, crisp night inside their makeshift shelter. As they settled in, a strange, unsettling energy began to permeate the campsite. It wasn't long before they realized they were not alone. The quiet was broken not by the expected sounds of mountain predators like a bear or a mountain lion, but by something profoundly more disturbing. From the darkness surrounding their camp, creatures began to make themselves known. They didn't attack outright, but they made their presence felt through sound. At first, it was a series of whoops, sharp, piercing calls that echoed through the deep canyon, vibrating with an intensity that seemed to rattle the very bones of the hunters. The calls were rhythmic, yet alien. These weren't the sounds of any animal known to science. Then, the vocalizations shifted. The creatures began to communicate with each other in a bizarre, nonsensical language. To Ron and his friends, it sounded like a complex form of speech, filled with clicks, grunts, and vocal patterns that possessed a structured cadence, yet the meaning was completely indecipherable. It was as if they were listening to a conversation taking place in a language that predated human history. The hunters sat in paralyzed silence inside their shelter, the firelight flickering against the canvas, throwing long, anxious shadows across their faces. They were experienced men, yet they felt like small, defenseless children in the face of whatever was pacing outside. They were being surrounded. Whatever these beings were, they were coordinated, intelligent, and operating with a terrifying purpose. The atmosphere was thick with a primal fear, a visceral realization that they were no longer the ones in control of their surroundings. They were, for the first time in their lives, the intruders. When morning finally broke, the woods returned to their typical, eerie calm. The creatures had vanished, leaving behind only the crushing weight of the memory of that night. But Ron Moorhead could not let it go. The experience was too vivid, too grounded in reality to be dismissed as a nightmare or a hallucination. Driven by a mix of curiosity and an obsessive need for answers, Ron returned to the site, this time with a very specific tool, high-quality recording equipment. He wanted to capture what they had heard. Setting up the microphones in the same desolate, unforgiving landscape, they waited. And the creatures returned. This time, Ron successfully recorded the audio. When he later played it back, the tapes confirmed what his gut had been telling him all along. The recordings captured a chilling, high-pitched, and clearly structured dialogue between multiple entities. It wasn't a random collection of animal noises, it was a sophisticated, articulated interaction. In the years that followed, the tapes were analyzed by experts in acoustics, linguistics, and primatology. The findings were staggering. The experts confirmed that the vocalizations were not human-made. The range, the frequency, and the specific cadence of the sounds were beyond the physical capabilities of a human voice box. Furthermore, the analysis suggested that the vocalists were massive, speculated to be creatures standing between 7 and 8 feet tall. The 1971 Sierra Camp encounter remains a singular point in the annals of unexplained phenomena. For Ron Moorhead and those with him, it was a terrifying brush with the unknown, a night when the barrier between the human world and something else, something hidden and ancient, grew dangerously thin. They went into the mountains to hunt, but they came back as the hunted, bearing witness to a reality that science still struggles to explain, echoing from the dark, lonely canyons of the Sierra Nevada. And maybe that's the part we're not supposed to understand. Because in all three stories, one thing never changes. Whatever was out there never fully revealed itself. It stayed just far enough in the dark, just out of reach, leaving behind only fragments, broken evidence, impossible details, and questions no one can answer. So here's what you have to ask yourself. Were these just coincidences? Misinterpretations? Or are they small glimpses of something we're not meant to see? Something that doesn't follow our rules, waiting and only moving when it knows no one will believe in it. Because if even one of these stories is true, it means one thing. It's still there. And the only reason we don't see it is because it doesn't want to be seen. What do you think? A coincidence or something much more concerning? Let me know your opinion in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Just after midnight on June 17th, 1939, a low murmur began to build on a quiet street in the city of Versailles, France. The street itself was unremarkable, lined with plain buildings, but on this particular night, it was becoming the center of a strange and growing spectacle. People were starting to gather, arriving in small groups, their voices a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet dread. They stood in clusters on the cobblestones, their faces illuminated by the occasional gas lamp, all eyes fixed on one specific building. It was the Saint-Pierre prison, a stone structure that held one of the most infamous men in all of France. The atmosphere in the crowd was electric, a kind of dark energy you could almost feel in the air. Everyone knew exactly why they were there. They knew what they were about to witness, an event that hadn't been seen in that region for a very long time. But even with that knowledge, there was a heavy sense of anticipation. It was a morbid curiosity that had drawn them out of their beds and into the cool night air. Some people in the crowd were trying to cope with the tension by turning it into a social event. They passed around flasks of alcohol, their laughter a little too loud, their jokes a little too forced. They were trying to create a festive mood as if they were waiting for a parade to start. But others were much more subdued. They stood silently, their arms crossed, their expressions grim. They were there not for entertainment, but to see what they believed was justice, a final, definitive end to a chapter of terror that had gripped the country. The man inside the prison was Eugene Weidmann, a 31-year-old German national who had been convicted of multiple murders. His crimes were brutal, calculated, and driven by greed, and his trial had been a media sensation. He and his small gang had preyed on tourists visiting Paris, luring them to a secluded villa with the promise of a good investment or a sightseeing trip, only to rob and kill them. The story of his last victim, a young American dancer named Jean de Koven, had been particularly heartbreaking and had sealed his fate in the public consciousness. So for many in the crowd, this night was about closure. Sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, a set of heavy doors on the prison building creaked open. The crowd instantly went quiet. Every head turned. A group of men emerged, all dressed in identical dark uniforms. They didn't speak a word to the crowd or even acknowledge their presence. They moved with a purpose that was both unnerving and fascinating. The crowd, which had been pressing forward, instinctively began to back away, creating a wide open space in front of the prison. These men carried with them pieces of heavy lumber and a collection of tools. They walked to the center of the cleared space and, without any spoken commands, they began to work. They were there to build the instrument of justice, the very reason everyone had gathered. They were building a guillotine. The crowd watched, mesmerized. They wanted to get a closer look, to see the grim machine take shape, but a sense of fear or perhaps respect for the process kept them at a distance. They formed a silent half moon around the workers. The men moved with incredible efficiency, a seamless choreography born from practice. It was clear that this was not the first time they had performed this task. Every movement was precise, economical, and devoid of any emotion. It was just a job to them. One man would place a beam on the ground, and another would be right there with the hardware to fasten it. They assembled the two tall upright posts, the bois de justice or woods of justice that would guide the blade. Then came the heavy angled blade itself attached to a weighted block called a mouton. It was hoisted to the top of the posts and locked into place, gleaming under the streetlights. They assembled the bascule, the tilting plank on which the condemned would be strapped, and the lunette, the wooden collar that would clamp around the neck. By about 3 a.m, the structure was complete. It stood there, tall and imposing, a skeletal silhouette against the night sky. The workers placed a large wicker basket next to it and a smaller metal bucket directly under where the blade would fall. Then, just as silently as they had arrived, they packed up their leftover tools and materials, turned around, and disappeared back inside the prison, closing the heavy doors behind them. With the guillotine now standing ready, the crowd's restlessness grew. The initial nervous energy began to curdle into impatience. They knew the next time those doors opened, the main event would begin. The show they had all come to see was imminent. But minutes turned into an hour, and then longer. The prison remained silent. The crowd started to murmur again, wondering what the delay was. Everyone knew that public executions were supposed to happen before dawn. The official policy was to conduct them in darkness, or at the very least, in the dim light of early morning. This was done to maintain a degree of somberness and, more practically, to prevent the press from getting clear photographs or film of the event. Officials didn't want the proceedings to turn into a media circus. But for some unknown reason, things were being held up inside the prison. As the delay stretched on, the crowd grew louder. The more boisterous members, fueled by alcohol, started shouting and jeering. The atmosphere was losing its grim solemnity and was taking on the ugly feel of a mob. Then, around 4:45 in the morning, a soft gray light began to appear on the eastern horizon. The sun was coming up. The delay had been too long. And with the daylight came the press in full force. Photographers jockeyed for the best positions, setting up their tripods and aiming their large cameras at the prison doors. Newsreel cameramen were there too, ready to capture the entire event on film. At this point, most people in the crowd assumed it was over. They figured the authorities had missed their window and would call it off. Surely, they wouldn't proceed in broad daylight in front of all these cameras. But they were wrong. At exactly 4:50 in the morning, the prison doors swung open one last time. Standing in the threshold was Eugene Weidman. His arms were bound tightly behind his back. He was wearing a simple white shirt, and the collar had been carefully folded down, tucked inside, leaving his neck completely bare and exposed. On either side of him stood a grim-faced prison guard. They pulled him forward, out into the morning light, and towards the waiting crowd. Behind him, the executioners, dressed head to toe in black, filed out and took up their positions around the guillotine. As Weidman was led out, the crowd erupted. The sound was a wild, chaotic roar. People were shrieking, howling, and laughing. They pointed at him, booing and shouting insults. The scene had descended into a complete frenzy, a bloodthirsty spectacle that no one had anticipated. Eugene Weidman kept his head down the entire time. He seemed to be making a conscious effort not to look at the jeering crowd, and certainly not at the towering machine that awaited him. He shuffled forward, his steps guided by the two guards. They turned him and walked him directly towards the base of the guillotine. When they reached it, the black-clad executioners took over. They moved with the same swift, impersonal efficiency as the men who had built the structure. They grabbed Weidman and maneuvered him onto the tilting plank. They slid him forward on his stomach, pushing him along the wooden platform until his head passed through the semicircular opening of the lunette. Another piece of wood slid into place, clamping his neck securely. He was now positioned perfectly, his neck directly beneath the massive, angled blade that dangled high above him. His head was positioned over the metal bucket on the ground, which would have been the last thing he saw. At this point, the crowd was at a fever pitch. Their shouts reached a crescendo. One of the executioners, the chief executioner, Jules-Henri Desfourneaux, calmly reached out and pulled a lever. There was a sharp metallic click, followed by a swishing sound as the heavy blade was released. It came soaring down the tracks with incredible speed. In less than a second, it was over. His head was severed from his body. The head fell cleanly into the metal bucket below. Immediately, the executioners pushed his now lifeless torso off the plank and into the large wicker basket that had been placed beside the guillotine. The guards and executioners then gathered up Weidman's remains, the basket, and the bucket, and carried everything back inside the prison. The whole procedure, from the moment Weidman appeared at the door to the moment his body was taken away, lasted only a matter of minutes. As the prison doors closed, the crowd, instead of dispersing, went wild with a strange celebratory energy. They cheered and then surged forward, running up to the guillotine. They began dabbing their scarves and handkerchiefs in the pool of Eugene Weidman's blood that had collected on the cobblestones. They were taking home a souvenir from the execution. It was a ghastly medieval scene, and because the sun had been out, it was all captured in stark detail. The photographers had their pictures, and the newsreel cameras had their film. In the days that followed, the headlines all across France were not about the execution of a notorious killer, but about the shocking and barbaric behavior of the crowd. The photographs and news reports painted a picture of a bloodthirsty mob cheering and celebrating a man's death. It made France look uncivilized, and the story became an international embarrassment. The French president at the time, Albert Lebrun, was said to be absolutely horrified by the reports and the accompanying images of the so-called hysterical public. He and other French leaders decided that the spectacle of public executions had no place in a modern society. They concluded that these events did not serve as a deterrent to crime, but instead only encouraged the basest and most violent instincts in the public. And so, a decision was made. From that point forward, there would be no more public executions in France. The guillotine would continue to be the state's method of capital punishment for several more decades, but its use would be hidden away from public view, carried out behind the high, cold walls of prisons. Eugene Weidman's execution on June 17, 1939, was the very last time the public would ever witness the guillotine in action. There's a strange and unsettling footnote to the science of death by guillotine. For centuries, there have been anecdotal reports and debates about whether the head remains conscious even for a few moments after being separated from the body. It's said that consciousness can persist for about 10 to 12 seconds. There are numerous historical accounts where, after the blade fell, an executioner would pick up the severed head and yell the condemned person's name. In some of these cases, it was reported that the head's eyes would turn towards the sound of the voice and the eyelids would blink, or the mouth would try to form words. This would continue for several seconds before the lack of oxygen finally shut down the brain and all signs of life vanished. The thought that a person could be aware of their own decapitation, even for a fleeting moment, adds another layer of grimness to an already brutal process. The images captured on that morning in Versailles served as a stark and permanent record of the end of an era, a final, public performance of state-sanctioned death that ultimately repulsed the very society it was meant to serve. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the evening of Friday, the 21st of May, 1993, a 29-year-old woman named Kem Winginger stood in the basement of the Golden Congregational Church in a small, rural part of Iowa. Her face was lit up with a genuine, happy smile as she clapped her hands together. Around her were her closest friends, people who had watched her go through some very tough times, and now they were all here to celebrate a new beginning for her. They had gathered to throw Kem and her fiancé, a 32-year-old man named Kurt Simon, a party. It was a combination wedding shower and a goodbye party, because their lives were about to change in a big way. Just then, a couple of her friends brought out their gift. It wasn't something fancy or expensive. It was a money tree, a little plant sitting in a small yellow coffee can. But hanging from its branches were dozens of small envelopes, and inside each one was a little bit of cash. Kem and Kurt both looked at it, their smiles growing even wider. They started to move through the small crowd, giving everyone a hug, thanking them for their kindness and their generosity. This was a huge night for them. It felt like all the plans they had been making, all the dreams they had been dreaming, were finally starting to fall into place. The very next day, they were going to pack up the last of Kurt's belongings into their car. They would then drive 230 miles south, away from the small Iowa town where he had been living, to the city of Bloomington, Illinois. Bloomington was just outside of Chicago, and it was where Kem already lived. And there, in Bloomington, they would start their new life together. They were going to be a family. A soon-to-be married couple raising Kem's 2 young children from her previous relationships. Their relationship had moved quickly. It had only been about 8 months since they had first met, and it had been on a blind date of all things. But for Kem, it was almost immediate. She knew from the start that Kurt was special, that he was the one. But getting to this point, to this happy night in a church basement, had not been easy. They were both struggling financially. Kurt was in the middle of his studies to become a Presbyterian minister, which is why he was living in Iowa to finish up at seminary school. Kem was a single mom in Bloomington, and she had recently been forced to quit her office job. A coworker there had been sexually harassing her, and she just couldn't take it anymore. To make ends meet, she had taken on work that paid her in cash, under the table. She was cutting hair and cleaning houses, but it wasn't enough. She still had to rely on public assistance to feed her kids and pay the rent. On top of the money problems, the long-distance relationship itself was just draining. All the driving back and forth, the hundreds of miles separating them, it was exhausting for both of them. And then there was the drama with the fathers of her 2 children. Her relationships with them were difficult, to say the least. The father of her 1-year-old son was a man named Dale Fosdick. He was always late with his child support payments, which put a huge strain on Kem's already tight budget. And he still acted like he had the right to just walk into her house whenever he pleased, without even knocking. It drove her crazy. Recently, Kurt had actually confronted Dale about it. He had told him, man to man, to stop doing that, to respect Kem's space. Dale did not take that well at all. And the father of her 7-year-old daughter, a man named Todd Wanger, wasn't much better. Todd and Kem fought constantly. They were always arguing over their custody arrangement and visitation schedules. To make things even more frustrating for Kem, her 2 exes, Dale and Todd, were actually friends with each other. It was a strange alliance that really annoyed her. But now, as she stood in that church basement and someone handed her a slice of cake, all of those problems, all of that stress, it all seemed to be getting a little bit smaller. It felt like it was all in the rearview mirror. Kurt was finally moving in with her. Her life was about to get organized, stable. Back at her home in Bloomington, she had a whole stack of Modern Bride magazines waiting for her. She was so excited to start planning their wedding. She and Kurt had even started talking about the possibility of Kurt adopting her young son. And she knew that with his education, Kurt could quickly find a good job in Bloomington as a pastoral counselor. They could start saving some money, especially since they would only have 1 household to pay for now instead of 2. This money tree was a perfect start. Kem knew that the people in this congregation weren't wealthy. Not by a long shot. But the fact that they had all pooled their limited resources together to give her and Kurt such a wonderful and thoughtful gift, it really touched her. The only thing that could have made this moment better, truly perfect, would have been if her own mother, a woman everyone called Cricket, was there to share it with them. But unfortunately, Kem and Cricket were estranged. They didn't speak. Kem wished things were different. She wished she could be closer to her mom, but Cricket had a mean streak. She could be cruel. And for some reason that Kem could never quite understand, she absolutely hated Kurt. Kem finished her slice of cake and glanced at her watch. She realized it was getting late. She gently tapped Kurt on the shoulder while he was in the middle of a conversation with some friends. They still had so much to do tomorrow morning. They had to finish packing, and then they had that long drive ahead of them. So, Kem and Kurt made their final goodbyes, thanking everyone one last time. They walked out of the church together, holding hands, ready to start the next chapter of their lives. The next day was Saturday, May 22nd. Just as they had planned, Kem and Kurt spent the entire morning packing up boxes, loading the car, and saying their final farewells in Iowa. The second half of the day was spent on the road, driving south towards Illinois. Finally, at 10:30 that night, they pulled their car into the driveway of Kem's two-story house in Bloomington. This was it. This was the home they would now share together. For a moment, Kem just sat there in the passenger seat looking at the house. Kurt got out of the car and walked around to the back to open up the trunk. There was a lot of stuff to carry inside, but Kem was just so tired from the long day. She honestly didn't feel like moving just yet. So she watched as Kurt grabbed the first box and the little money tree they had been given. He walked up the front stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. A minute or so later, he came back out, his hands empty. At that point, Kem let out a little sigh. She knew she had to get up and help. She couldn't let him do it all by himself. Kurt was already halfway back down the front steps as Kem grabbed a box of her own from the trunk. She made her way up the same steps and walked into the foyer of her home. She set her box down on the floor and was just about to turn around and head back outside to do another trip with Kurt. But then she paused. Her eyes caught something on the floor of the foyer. It was something she didn't recognize. Something that definitely had not been there when she had left for Iowa just a couple of days ago. Kurt was outside, his back to the house, when an incredible wave of pressure slammed into him. It was so intense, so powerful, that it almost threw him off his feet. At almost the exact same instant, a deafening boom like a massive explosion filled his ears. He stumbled forward, trying to keep his balance, and then he spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. He screamed out Kem's name. But his ears were ringing so badly now, a high-pitched whine that blocked out everything else. He couldn't tell if she had answered him or not. He looked up at the house and saw thick, black smoke pouring out from the front doorway. Without even thinking, his instincts took over. He just ran. He ran back up the stairs and straight into the house, into the smoke-filled foyer, desperate to find Kem. When he got inside, it was pure chaos. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. There were shards of broken glass scattered everywhere. He also noticed dozens of little pieces of twisted metal all over the floor and embedded in the walls. Kurt screamed Kem's name again and again, his voice raw with panic. He looked frantically all around, trying to see through the haze and the rubble, but it was almost impossible. It was like the entire foyer had been obliterated. Now he was starting to gasp for air, choking on the acrid smoke. He started moving around the small space, ducking down below the thickest clouds of smoke, trying to see anything. And that's when he saw them. Lying on the floor, partially obscured by a fallen piece of drywall, were a pair of legs. Just a few minutes later, Detective Larry Shepard of the Bloomington Police Department pulled his cruiser up to the curb outside the two-story house. His partner was in the seat next to him, and another squad car was right behind them. Normally, Shepard wouldn't respond to a typical 911 call. He was a homicide detective. but he had been in the area when the call came over the radio. Dispatch had requested officers to check out a report of a possible shotgun blast on a quiet residential street. But the second Shepard stepped out of his car and laid eyes on that house, he knew this was no shotgun blast. Black smoke was billowing out of the front door. He couldn't see any flames, but he could clearly hear the high-pitched shriek of a fire alarm coming from inside. The street itself was in chaos. People, who Shepard assumed were neighbors, were out of their houses, shouting and running around in a panic. And there was debris everywhere. Broken glass, splintered pieces of wood, and strange chunks of metal had been blown out of the house and were scattered all over the front lawn and even out into the street. In the driveway of the home, Shepard could see a man. He had his hands on his head, and he looked absolutely frantic. He was pacing back and forth, yelling the name Kem over and over again as he stared at the destroyed house. It was at that moment that Shepard realized there must be someone still inside. He knew he couldn't wait for the fire department or more backup to arrive. He had to go in now. He and his partner shouted for everyone on the street to stay back, to clear the area. And then they both raced up the stairs and into the smoke. Once Shepard was inside the foyer, he could tell there was no active fire, just a lot of smoke hanging heavy in the air. He quickly took in the scene. He saw a 6-inch hole blasted into the wall right next to the front door. And there was another, similar hole right in the floor of the foyer. But his attention was immediately drawn to the body of a woman lying on the ground. One look was all it took. It was immediately and horribly clear that there was nothing anyone could do for her. Literally half of her head was just gone. In his entire career, Detective Shepard had never worked a murder case where the weapon was a bomb. But as he stood there in that blackened, destroyed foyer, looking down at the charred body of this woman, Shepard felt certain that a bomb was exactly what he was looking at right now. Around this time, the officers from the second squad car had made their way up the stairs and into the house. But Shepard immediately told them to get back. He ordered them to go back outside. This was not a safe scene. They needed the fire department here to clear the smoke and check for structural damage. And more importantly, they needed the bomb squad. For all they knew, there could be more explosives in the house. Not long after, Shepard and the other officers stood on the front lawn as members of the fire department and the state police bomb squad began to carefully comb through the scene. By this point, Detective Shepard had learned a little more about what had happened. The woman who had been killed was Kem Winghanger, and the man he had seen screaming her name in the driveway was her fiancé, Kurt Simon. Neighbors had told the first responding officers that the couple had arrived home at around 10:30 that night. A couple of the neighbors had actually been outside and had noticed them when they started unloading their car. These neighbors said they saw Kurt go into the house first. He was carrying a box that he had taken from the back of the car. Then, these same neighbors said they saw Kurt come back out of the house empty-handed. But he didn't grab another box. Instead, he went back to the trunk of the car and seemed to be putting something inside. It was at that exact moment that Kem had grabbed a box of her own from the car and had gone into the house by herself. And that's when the explosion happened. Shepard was troubled by these accounts. It seemed very suspicious to him that Kurt had been able to walk into the house just fine without getting hurt. And then, just seconds later, Kem goes in, and her arrival seems to be what triggered the explosion. It made him wonder. Maybe that box Kurt was carrying when he first went inside, maybe that was the bomb. Maybe he planted it, and then when he left, Kem went in, and it went off. And what was it that Kurt had put back into the trunk of his car after he came out? What was he trying to hide? But what was even more suspicious than any of that was what a preliminary sweep of Kem's home had turned up in the basement. Investigators had found wires, gunpowder, and fuses. Shepard didn't need to be a bomb expert to know that these were the components of a bomb. And it meant that whoever killed Kem had likely built the bomb right there in her own basement. And that fact, more than anything else, made Kurt Simon his #1 suspect. So, Shepard told a crime scene technician to process Kurt's car. He told him to pay extra special attention to the trunk. Then, the detective walked over to Kurt himself. Kurt was on the ground now, rocking back and forth. He was crying, and he was still just repeating Kem's name over and over again, like a mantra. Shepard gently asked Kurt if he could tell him what had happened. Kurt looked up at him, his eyes vacant and full of shock. He told the detective that he didn't know what happened. He said he had gone inside with the box, and he had just started back down the stairs when he felt the blast happen behind him. At this, Shepard's eyes narrowed. According to the neighbors, Kurt was actually at the trunk of his car, putting something inside at the time of the explosion. But now, Kurt was claiming he had only just stepped out of the house, that he was still on the stairs when the bomb went off. It was a small discrepancy, but it was significant. It could just be the result of confusion and trauma. Or Kurt could be lying to cover up his involvement. But for now, Shepard just told Kurt that he needed him to come down to the station for questioning. Several hours later, just before dawn on Sunday, May 23rd, Detective Shepard walked out of an interrogation room at the Bloomington, Illinois police station. He had just spent more than an hour hammering Kurt Simon with questions about his murdered fiancée. And Kurt had been a difficult interview. He had all sorts of ideas about other people who might have wanted to kill Kem. He told Shepard that both of the fathers of Kem's children, Dale Fosdick and Todd Winganger, were always fighting with her. And he said that Kem's estranged mother, Wilma Lewis, the woman they called Cricket, was, in his exact words, every kind of evil. But Kurt seemed to have no information to offer about what he himself had actually seen or heard in the moments before the explosion. He stuck to his story that he hadn't seen anything suspicious at all in the foyer, which Shepard just found very hard to believe. Kurt also had no explanation for why the bomb had exploded when Kem entered the house and not when he did. And he completely denied knowing anything about the bomb-making materials that had been found in Kem's basement. Kurt also insisted he hadn't put anything back in his trunk around the time of the explosion, but he couldn't explain why multiple neighbors had said they saw him do just that. Shepard felt that Kurt was either the most unobservant person he had ever met, or he was lying through his teeth. And to top it all off, Kurt had flat out refused to take a lie detector test. Still, Shepard had to let him go home. The detective just didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. Not yet, anyway. At this point, the bomb squad was still methodically searching the house for any other devices. That meant the crime scene technicians hadn't even been able to get inside yet to start looking for forensic evidence. They hadn't even been able to remove Kem's body. Shepard knew the day ahead was going to be long and incredibly busy. Other members of his team had spent the entire night canvassing the neighborhood and notifying Kem's family members, getting their initial statements. And now, Shepard was sure there was going to be a long line of people for him to interrogate. He had already been awake for a full 24 hours at this point, but he knew there would be no sleep for him anytime soon. So he walked over to the office coffee pot, poured himself a cup of stale black coffee, and stood there drinking it, thinking about how he was going to build a case and nail Kurt Simon for murder. Meanwhile, the story of the bombing was exploding across the news all over Illinois. By about 9 a.m. on Sunday, less than 12 hours after the explosion, there were reporters everywhere. They were milling around the front entrance of the police station, some of them even coming into the lobby, trying to talk to anyone who would give them a scrap of information. And Detective Shepard knew this story was only going to get bigger. The Illinois State Bomb Squad had just called in the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, to help them process the scene. All that meant was that there was going to be an enormous amount of public and political pressure on Shepard, who was the lead detective on the case. And this pressure was particularly stressful for him this morning because the case he thought he had against Kem's fiancée, Kurt Simon, was already starting to fall apart. In all their interviews with Kem's friends, every single one of them had said that Kem and Kurt had a wonderful relationship. They were deeply in love and were so excited to start their new life together. The crime scene unit had thoroughly searched Kurt's car, the car where neighbors had claimed they saw him putting something in the trunk right after the blast. But the technicians had found nothing suspicious at all. Nothing in the trunk, nothing anywhere else in the vehicle. Shepard's partner had also been busy checking out Kurt's alibi. Kurt had told them he had spent the entire week before the explosion in Iowa, where he lived, and that he was just moving to Bloomington that weekend. They had checked it out, and it was true. He really had been in Iowa the whole time. This made Shepard's theory that Kurt had assembled the bomb in Kem's basement a lot less likely, since Kem had been home all week and Kurt was hundreds of miles away. Plus, Kem's babysitter had given the police 2 more pieces of information that really opened up the suspect pool. First, she said that the spare key to Kem's house had gone missing recently. And second, because that key was gone, Kem had gotten locked out of her own house at one point and had been forced to cut a hole in the screen of the back door to get inside. This meant that basically anyone could have gotten into Kem's house to build that bomb. They could have just come in through the damaged back door, or if they were the one who had stolen the spare key, they could have just walked right in the front. So, in the space of just a few hours, Shepard's suspect list had effectively gone from one person, Kurt Simon, to the entire city of Bloomington. Just before lunchtime, Shepard walked into the station's interrogation room where Kem's ex-husband, Todd Winghanger, was sitting and waiting for him. With Kurt looking less and less like a viable suspect, the detectives had turned their attention to Kem's exes. Both Todd, the father of her daughter, and Dale Fosdick, the father of her son, not only had clear motives, but they also knew Kem's schedule inside and out. In fact, each of them had been watching one of her children over the weekend while she was in Iowa. They knew exactly when she would be gone and when she would be coming back. Shepard's partner had actually already spoken to Dale a couple of hours after the explosion, while Shepard himself had been busy questioning Kurt. During that initial conversation, Dale had seemed genuinely shocked and upset by Kem's death. He had made what seemed like a real effort to answer the detective's questions, though his young son was with him and kept crying, constantly interrupting them. Dale did admit that there was tension between him and Kem. But he also had an alibi. He said he had been with his family that morning and then spent the afternoon and evening doing yard work in full view of all his neighbors. He had given Shepard's partner a list of names and phone numbers of people who could verify his story. A first round of calls to those witnesses seemed to suggest that Dale was telling the truth. But the detectives were conducting all of these interviews with very little solid information about the crime itself. They didn't really know how the bomb that killed Kem actually worked. They weren't sure if the killer had to be nearby to detonate it with some kind of remote, or if it had been on a timer. The scientists at the ATF were painstakingly trying to reconstruct the bomb from all the little fragments of shrapnel they had collected from the scene. But until they could do that, Shepard and his partner wouldn't know exactly when the killer would have needed to be at Kem's house. And none of the neighbors had reported seeing anything unusual around the time of the explosion that could help them narrow down that window. So now, as Detective Shepard sat down across the metal interrogation table from Kem's ex-husband, Todd Winghanger, he started with some general questions about his relationship with Kem. Todd seemed a little nervous. He kept wringing his hands as he spoke. He admitted that he and Kem did fight, mostly about child support costs. And he said he had been very frustrated with her during their divorce proceedings. He didn't feel like she was being fair. But he was adamant that none of that meant he wanted to hurt her. He insisted that their problems were just typical for most divorced couples. Shepard didn't put much stock in that. In his experience, a messy divorce or a bad breakup, especially when money was involved, was a very powerful motive for violence. So he asked Todd where he had been all day on Saturday, the night of the blast. At this question, Todd visibly relaxed. He leaned back in his chair and launched into a very detailed, moment-by-moment explanation of his entire day. He said he had been with his daughter and his new girlfriend, and he was certain that both of them would vouch for him. He also gave the detective a list of several other people who had seen them out and about during the day. By the time Shepard sent Todd home, he really wasn't sure what to think. He couldn't decide which of the exes, Todd or Dale, was a better suspect. Both of them clearly had issues with Kem and had a motive, but both of them also seemed to have solid alibi witnesses. On the other hand, Kem's fiancé, Kurt, might have had the opportunity to plant the bomb if it was placed just moments before the explosion, but he had no clear motive at all. So Todd and Dale had motive but no opportunity, and Kurt had opportunity but no motive. Shepard felt like he was just going in circles. He decided his next move should be to talk to Kem's family again. Maybe they could help him make sense of his very flawed suspect list. On Sunday evening, almost a full 24 hours after the explosion, Detective Shepard knocked on the door of the home where Kem's sister Joni lived. Another officer had already been there earlier to deliver the terrible news to her and their mother, Cricket, but Shepard wanted to hear from them himself. He had been told that Kem and her mother were estranged. But even though he went into the situation expecting it to be a little strange, Shepard was still completely caught off guard by the way Cricket was acting. It was beyond strange. It was way over the top. Joni answered the door and welcomed Shepard inside, offering him a seat on the couch. She was crying, her face puffy and red. Her reaction to the violent death of her sister seemed completely genuine and normal. But Cricket was not crying. She wasn't showing any signs of sadness or grief at all. Instead, she was just furious. And she wasn't furious about the murder itself, or about the fact that her daughter was dead, or even that the police hadn't made an arrest yet. No, she was furious about her daughter's life insurance policy. Apparently, Kem had not listed her as a beneficiary, which meant that Cricket was not going to get any money from her daughter's death. As Shepard sat there listening to this woman complain about money, he thought back to what Kurt had said during his interrogation. He had insisted that Cricket was a horrible person, that she was evil. At the time, Shepard hadn't really taken it that seriously. He figured Kurt was just trying to throw suspicion off of himself, and he knew that lots of people don't get along with their in-laws. But now, sitting here, he was starting to reconsider. He felt like he was witnessing someone who might just be as bad as Kurt had described. Then, when Shepard actually asked Cricket about her relationship with her daughter, Cricket just went off on a tirade. But she didn't really talk about her relationship with Kem. She talked about Kurt, and how Kurt had supposedly ruined Kem's life. She said Kurt was a terrible partner for Kem, and that he had destroyed the best relationship Kem ever had, which, according to Cricket, was with Dale Fosdick, the father of Kem's son. She also blamed Kurt for destroying her own relationship with Kem. She claimed that she and her daughter used to talk on the phone every single day, but once Kurt came into the picture, he had forbidden Kem to speak to her. To Shepard, Cricket seemed completely scattered. She was jumping from one angry subject to another, just mad at the entire world. But he started to wonder if what he was seeing wasn't just pure selfishness and a terrible personality. Maybe it was some kind of very complicated grief, or maybe even guilt. Or maybe it was grief and guilt all mixed together. But one thing was absolutely clear. Cricket hated Kurt just as much as Kurt seemed to hate her. And Shepard had no idea which one of them was telling the truth. It was around this point in the bizarre conversation that Kem's sister Joni cut in. She offered up a potential suspect of her own. She told the detective that Kem had recently left a job because a male colleague there, a man named Phil Hartman, had been sexually harassing her. Following the incident, Kem had actually received a financial settlement from the company. And apparently, Phil had made threats against her afterwards, including a promise that he would get her for what she had done. And so Joni said that it was Phil who the police really needed to be investigating for this murder. When Shepard finally left that house, his head was spinning. He had gone to talk to Cricket and Joni, hoping to get some clarity, hoping to sort out his three main suspects. But he had come away with even less clarity, and now he had 5 suspects. There was Kem's fiancé Kurt, her 2 exes Dale Fosdick, and Todd Winghanger, her former co-worker Phil Hartman, and frankly, Cricket herself. By now, it was late on Sunday night, and Shepard had been awake since Saturday morning. He was exhausted. He decided the best thing he could do for the case, and for himself, was to just go home and get some sleep. That way, he could come back with a clear head on Monday morning and maybe, just maybe, start to make some sense of it all. On the afternoon of Monday, May 24th, almost 2 full days after the bombing that killed Kem Winghanger, Detective Larry Shepard walked through the front door of Kem's house. He was feeling cautiously optimistic. On the night the bomb went off, the police had to evacuate the scene so the state bomb squad and the ATF could make sure there were no additional explosives. But finally, the night before, the scene had officially been cleared, which meant Shepard could now enter the house and look around for himself. Inside, the foyer was still in complete disarray, although by this point, Kem's body had been removed and taken for an autopsy. There were now dozens of little evidence flags and markers all over the floor and walls, pointing out where she had been positioned when she fell, and where various bomb fragments and other pieces of evidence had been collected. And now, because the federal agents had completed their preliminary assessment of the bomb, Shepard could actually start to picture how the bombing had happened. There was that 6-inch hole in the foyer floor. Shepard now knew that that was where the bomb had been placed. It had been sitting right there on the ground, probably concealed inside some kind of small box or package. From the autopsy report, which had shown very specific and distinct damage to Kem's right hand, Shepard knew what had likely happened. She had spotted the package on the floor, she had bent down and picked it up with her right hand, and that action, that movement, had triggered the explosion. And this was the single most important piece of information the feds had been able to determine: the bomb was motion activated. This was a huge breakthrough. It meant the bomber did not have to be at or even anywhere near Kem's house to trigger the explosion manually. Which meant they could have left that bomb there anytime over the weekend or even before. This also explained why investigators had found a random assortment of wires and other bomb-making materials in the basement. If the bomb had been built somewhere else and then transported to Kem's house in a car, the simple bumps and vibrations of the drive could have accidentally set it off. So, what most likely happened was that Kem's killer brought a partially finished bomb to the house, a bomb that was stable and wouldn't detonate while they were carrying it. And then they put the final volatile touches on it right there on site once it was in position in the foyer. This also meant that the bomber had to be pretty sophisticated. Building a motion-activated bomb like this took a certain amount of technical skill. It took intelligence and a real attention to detail, because if you make one wrong move, you set off the bomb and kill yourself. And so, in Shepard's mind, this likely took Kem's mother, Cricket, right off the suspect list. She just did not strike him as organized enough or coherent enough to pull off something this complex. She just seemed way too scatterbrained. Kem's exes, Dale Fosdick and Todd Winganger, both worked with their hands, with machines, for a living. So, they were definitely still on the list. And her fiancé, Kurt, was highly educated, so he was still a possibility as well. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the coworker Kem had accused of sexual harassment. He had managed to reach Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew that just being physically far away from the bomb when it detonated was not a perfect alibi anymore, not with a motion-activated device. The killer could have placed it days before and then traveled. But still, Louisiana was a really long way away. And as far as Shepard could tell, Phil didn't seem to have any kind of technical background. So Phil was still on the list, but he was moving down it. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house. They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then they had clearly spent a good amount of time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came upstairs and were in the foyer, setting the thing up. This was someone who was incredibly confident that they were not going to get caught doing all of this inside the house. That was some serious boldness. And so, Shepard was starting to feel pretty certain that whoever had done this was either a family member or someone so close to Kem that they might as well have been family. Shepard left Kem's house, his mind already planning his next steps. He was thinking about how he could get search warrants for both Dale and Todd's workplaces to see if any of the machinery or tools they used there shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final front step and onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out his name from behind him. He turned to see another Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created a real sense of panic, not just in Bloomington, but all across the state of Illinois. People were now terrified that a bomb was going to show up on their own front porch. They were seeing packages they didn't recognize and calling the police, convinced that they could be explosives. It was like a wave of paranoia had swept over the state. In response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger and more visible presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked his officers to re-canvass Kem's neighborhood to go back and question all the neighbors again now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, they now knew that the bomb was motion activated. This meant the bomber did not need to be there right before it went off. They could have been in the house building the bomb days before. They could have planted the bomb well in advance of the bombing itself. So there was a much bigger window of time now. They were asking the neighbors different questions. Who was at Kem's house in the days leading up to the bombing? Did anyone see anyone acting suspicious near Kem's house that entire weekend? And so this officer who was running over to Shepard, that's what he had been doing. Re-canvassing the neighborhood. And when he finally reached Shepard, out of breath, he told him he'd found something. Shepard eagerly followed the officer over to one of Kem's neighbors' houses. And there on the front lawn, he saw a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing nervously next to her father. And based on what this little girl would say, along with all the evidence collected by the Bloomington Police Department and the ATF, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Kem Winghanger on the 22nd of May 1993. At around 10:30 that morning, the killer pulled up in their car and parked on the street outside of Kem's house. They reached over and picked up a bag that was sitting on their passenger seat. Inside the bag was a partially completed pipe bomb and some tools. With the bag in hand, they got out of the car, walked up to the front door, and pulled a key from their pocket. It was the same key they had stolen from under Kem's doormat a few months earlier. They used the key to unlock the front door and let themselves inside. The killer then walked down to the basement. They took all the various items out of the bag, placed them on a counter, and got to work. The killer was not worried at all about getting caught. They knew this neighborhood very well. Everybody in this neighborhood knew them, and no one would find it suspicious to see them there at Kem's house. Plus, they knew they would have a perfect alibi for the time period when the bomb would actually go off. Once the bomb was mostly assembled, the killer gathered up most of their things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but they figured it didn't really matter, since the explosion would destroy all the evidence anyway. Feeling very confident in their work, the killer walked back upstairs and placed the nearly completed bomb on the floor in the foyer. And then, as they completed the final delicate steps of arming the device, they could feel sweat beading on their forehead. They knew that if they did anything wrong, if their hands slipped, the bomb would go off right there in their face. But the killer got it all done. They stood up very slowly and carefully and walked back out through the front door. But before they could get in their car and drive away, they saw one of the neighborhood girls playing in the yard next door. The girl looked up at them and waved, and she said, "Hello." And the killer, feeling like they belonged there, feeling completely invisible, just waved back. Well, that little girl remembered that interaction. And she would tell Detective Shepard exactly who she saw leaving Kem's house that morning. It was none other than Kem's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son, Dale Fosdick. Dale was very upset that Kem had broken up with him and was now with Kurt. He had also heard from Cricket, who he was still very close with, that Kurt had been talking about adopting his son. And this enraged him. He could not stand the idea that his own boy might grow up calling another man dad. So he used the electronic skills and the tools he had acquired from his hobby of building model airplanes to construct a deadly pipe bomb. And so ultimately Dale was caught because of his own arrogance, his own sense of entitlement. He felt like he could just stroll into Kem's house anytime he wanted because he had done it so many times before, despite her telling him not to. He had become such a familiar face in the neighborhood that no one thought twice about seeing him there. And that's why that little girl remembered him. After months of painstaking forensic work that tied Dale even more closely to the components of the bomb, he was finally arrested. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 61 years in prison. But he would only serve 14 of those years. Because in 2010, while still behind bars, Dale died of a sudden illness. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2006, a young man named Dave Murphy had just achieved a lifelong goal. He had become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. Like any rookie, he was eager to get started, to put his training to use. His very first assignment was as a protective service officer. This role was all about providing physical security for a number of county-owned facilities. It wasn't exactly chasing down bad guys, but it was an important job, and for Dave, it was the first step in his new career. The first facility he was assigned to was the Capital City Theater. This wasn't just any building, it was a landmark in Salt Lake City. It had been standing since the early 1900s, a beautiful, grand, old theater with a rich history. And it was about to become a huge part of Dave's life, in ways he never could have imagined. So, in early August of that year, Dave reported to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job. He was a little nervous, a little excited, ready to learn the ropes. The first person he met was his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. Dave walked in, ready to introduce himself and get to know the guy he'd be spending his nights with. But right away, Dave could tell that Morgan was strictly business. There was no friendly chatter, no welcome to the team. Morgan was all pro, a bit cold, and seemed focused on one thing, the job. The very first thing Morgan did was take Dave to the control room. This room was the nerve center of the theater's security, and it was located on the first floor. The theater itself was a big place, with 3 main floors and a full basement. Inside the control room, a bank of monitors flickered, displaying feeds from security cameras positioned all over the building. Morgan explained that the cameras were old, though. Their quality was poor. You could really only make out what was happening on screen if a light was on in that specific area. At night, when most of the lights were off, the screens were just fuzzy patches of black and gray. It wasn't an ideal system, but it was what they had. After the brief tour of the control room, Morgan turned to Dave. He said, "Now we're going to go do our rounds." He explained that this was a mandatory procedure. Every single shift, at the very beginning and at the very end, they had to do a full security sweep of the entire building. They had to check every door, make sure every light that was supposed to be off was off, and ensure the entire theater was secure before they could settle in for the night or head home. Morgan led the way, and their first stop was the basement. Dave followed him down a set of stairs, and the moment they stepped onto the basement level, Dave was taken aback. The place was huge. It wasn't just a small storage area, it was a massive, long hallway that stretched out into the dimness seemingly forever. The lighting down there was poor, just a few bare bulbs casting long, eerie shadows. Everything in the building was old, and you could really feel the age of the place in the basement. Right in the middle of this vast, empty hallway, there was a piano. It was just sitting there, a dark, silent shape that seemed completely out of place. Dave remembered thinking how incredibly creepy the whole scene was. This long, shadowy hallway with all these closed doors lining the walls, and this lone piano in the center of it all. An immediate, uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. He thought to himself that he really did not want to spend much time down here. But it was part of the job. So, he and Morgan walked the entire length of the hall. They checked every single door, making sure it was locked tight. They then made their way back up, systematically clearing the main floor, then the second floor, and finally the third floor. They checked every room, every closet, every corner. Everything was secure. After the round was complete, they returned to the control room. Dave was hoping that now, with the initial tour out of the way, he might get to know Morgan a bit. This was his partner, after all. They were going to be relying on each other for long hours in this empty building. But Morgan remained cold and distant. He barely spoke to Dave, offering only short, direct answers to any questions. It was clear he did not want to make small talk. And as their shift neared its end, Dave noticed that Morgan seemed almost desperate to get the final security round over with and just get out of the building. At the end of that first night, Dave drove home with a strange feeling. There was just something off about Morgan's behavior. It wasn't just that he was quiet, it was more than that. It felt like Morgan genuinely hated being in that theater. Dave had a gut feeling he was onto something. And it would turn out he was absolutely right. Morgan did not like being in that building, but it would take a little while before he was willing to tell Dave the reason why. For the next couple of days, Dave and Morgan did their security rounds together. Dave was still in training, so Morgan was showing him the exact procedure for securing every part of the massive building. Then, on August 9th, just 2 days after Dave's first shift, Morgan decided Dave was ready to handle it on his own. At the end of their shift, as it was time for the final sweep, Morgan told Dave to do the security round by himself. Dave felt confident. He'd done it a few times now and knew the layout. He started in the basement, just like they always did. He walked down that long, creepy hall, checking each door handle, making sure the lights were off. He finished the basement and went up to the first floor where the control room was. He checked all the rooms there, then moved into the main auditorium space. He walked through the rows of empty seats, checking all the little nooks and crannies to make sure no one was hiding out. From there, he went up to the second floor. He checked the rooms there, walked along the balcony overlooking the stage, and then made his way to the third and final floor. The third floor housed the offices for the theater's staff. At the very end of his search, the last room he needed to check was the rehearsal room. This room was a bit different from the others. It didn't have a door. It was just an open doorway. The procedure was simple: poke your head in, look around to make sure it was empty, and then move on. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room. He reaches in and flips the light switch on. The room floods with light. He scans it quickly. It's empty. Satisfied, he flips the light back off and turns to head back into the hallway to finish his shift. But just as he's turning, he hears an incredibly loud noise. A door right across the hallway from him slams shut with tremendous force. It was the bathroom door. His police instincts kicked in immediately. His first thought was that someone must have been hiding in the building. They had been in the bathroom, saw him coming, and made a run for it, slamming the door behind them as they tried to escape. He instinctively grabbed his radio. He called down to Morgan in the control room, his voice tense. "Someone's on the third floor," he said. Morgan immediately looked at the camera feed for the third floor hallway. But he didn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. Back on the third floor, Dave had already drawn his weapon. He was looking up and down the long hall, but he saw nothing. As he stood there, waiting for Morgan to come up and provide backup so they could search for this person, two things suddenly clicked in his mind. First, just because he heard the door slam didn't mean the person had run out. They could still be inside the bathroom. Maybe they slammed it from the inside to hide. He thought to himself, that's why Morgan can't see them on the camera. They're still in there. The second thing he realized sent a chill down his spine. That bathroom door, it couldn't slam. It was a heavy door fitted with a big, powerful hydraulic hinge, the kind that makes a door close slowly and silently. It was physically impossible for it to slam shut with that kind of force. His gun was now aimed directly at the bathroom door. A moment later, Morgan came up the stairs and appeared at his side. He saw the situation and drew his own pistol, aiming it at the door as well. They wordlessly agreed on a plan. On a count, they made entry, bursting into the bathroom, ready for a confrontation. They cleared every stall, every corner. But there was no one there. And there was no other way out. No windows, no vents big enough for a person. It was a dead end. Morgan and Dave were baffled. They figured the person must have run out after all and was now hiding somewhere else in the theater. They decided they weren't going to worry about how the door managed to slam. They just knew they had an intruder to find. So, with their guns still drawn, they left the bathroom and began a systematic search of the third floor. They checked every office, every closet. Every single door was still locked, just as Dave had left them. As they started making their way down the stairs to the second floor, Dave noticed something through the window in the stairwell door. The lights on the second floor were on. He remembered distinctly turning them all off just a few minutes ago. As they were walking down the stairs, he asked Morgan, "Hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor?" Morgan said no, he hadn't touched a thing. Their intruder, they thought, must be on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They pushed through the door, ready for anything. And they found that not only were all the lights on, but every single door on the second floor had been opened. Doors that Dave had personally checked and closed just minutes before were now standing wide open. They searched the entire second floor, room by room. They found nothing. No one was there. They methodically went through, turning off all the lights again and shutting and locking all the doors. They went down to the first floor. Everything there was exactly as it should be, lights off, doors locked. Then they descended back into the creepy basement. The tension was high now. They had searched almost the entire building and were expecting to finally come face to face with whoever was playing these games with them. But they found no one in the basement either. The entire theater was empty. Confused and on edge, they went back to the control room. They decided to review the security footage from the third floor, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone running down the hall when the door slammed. But the camera angle wasn't great. It was pointed down the hall, but you couldn't see the bathroom door itself. And of course, the hallway was dark, and the old cameras were useless without light. All they could see on the footage was the light from the rehearsal room turning on as Dave did his check. Then, a few seconds later, the light turned off. The screen went nearly black. And then, through the audio feed, they heard it. A massive, echoing slam. But they couldn't see what caused it. They had no explanation. They were both on edge, convinced someone could still be hiding somewhere. They did another full sweep of the entire building, just to be sure. Again, they found nothing. In the end, they had no choice but to chalk it up to something strange and unexplainable. Maybe they were just hearing things, seeing things. They decided to just get out of there and go home. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan was working a shift alone. Dave had the night off. Morgan was sitting in the control room monitoring the quiet building when he thought he heard something. It sounded like whispering coming from the hallway just behind him. After the experience with the slamming door a few nights earlier, he was already on high alert. He didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and stood up. He stepped out into the hallway, and as soon as he did, the whispering sound seemed to move, getting farther and farther away from him down the hall. He looked around, but the hall was empty. He cautiously made his way down the hallway towards the main stairwell that led either up to the second floor or down into the basement. When he got to the top of the stairs, guns still raised, he listened. And that's when he heard a new sound. It was the distinct sound of someone coughing, and it was coming from the basement. At this point, Morgan would later admit that he was genuinely scared. Imagine being all alone in this massive old theater. Just a few days ago, you had a bizarre experience with slamming doors and mysterious open rooms, something another police officer witnessed with you. Now, you're by yourself, hearing voices and coughing coming from the creepiest part of the building. It was terrifying. He very slowly started to make his way down the stairs, his heart pounding. He was getting ready to clear the corner and confront whoever was down there. But just as he reached the bottom of the stairwell, the coughing stopped. He flipped on the lights for the basement hall. He looked down the long, empty corridor. There was nothing there. He started making his way down the hall, checking every door, just like he and Dave always did. He got all the way to the far end of the basement, and as he was finishing his check, he suddenly smelled smoke. A strong, distinct smell of something burning. It was coming from a door right next to him. Thinking there was a fire, he quickly unlocked the door and went inside. But the room was empty. There was no fire. He turned the light on, looked everywhere, but there was nothing burning. The smell of smoke, however, was overwhelming. He was now convinced that there had to be a fire somewhere in the basement. He started going into every single room, one by one, searching for the source. But he found nothing. And then, as mysteriously as it had started, the smell of smoke just dissipated. It was gone. He did a full check of the entire theater, every floor, every room, looking for any sign of a fire. There was nothing. He thought about calling the fire department, but what would he tell them? That he smelled smoke for a few minutes, but now there's no fire? He checked the building 3 or 4 more times just to be absolutely sure. Confident there was no fire, he just had to accept that he couldn't explain it. He was smelling things that weren't there. A few weeks went by. On September 4th, Dave arrived for his shift a little early. It started at 5 p.m., but he got to the theater around 4:30. As he walked in, he saw 3 staff members sitting at the front desk just chatting. As he walked past, he overheard one of them talking about ghosts inside the theater. This immediately got his attention. He walked over to the man who was talking and introduced himself. The man's name was Blair Fuller, and he was a senior accountant for the theater. Dave told him that he handled security for the building and that he had experienced some strange things himself. He asked Blair if he would be willing to share what he knew. Blair agreed, and they headed up to his office on the 3rd floor. They sat down, and Blair said, "Okay, I've got a doozy for you." He told Dave that a couple of years ago he had been working late in this very office. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. As he was working, he heard the building's elevator kick on. The elevator was right outside his office, and it was an old, loud machine. It was really obvious whenever it was moving. He didn't think much of it at first. But then it clicked. He was the only person in the entire building. He looked out through the glass window of his office door. He could see the little lights above the elevator door that showed which floor it was on. The lights were lit up, and they were moving. The elevator was coming up from the basement. It passed the 1st floor, then the 2nd. Finally, it arrived at the 3rd floor. The doors slid open. There was no one inside. Blair said that at this point, he still wasn't too concerned. He figured maybe it was some kind of scheduled maintenance or an automatic cycle it ran at night. But after a little while, a loud alarm started going off in the elevator. It was the alarm that sounds when something is blocking the door, preventing it from closing. He looked out his office window again. He could hear the ringing sound, but he could clearly see that there was nothing obstructing the doorway. The doors were just stuck open. Curious, he left his office and walked over to the elevator. He stepped inside. He said that the moment he set foot in the elevator car, he felt a massive sudden drop in temperature. It was ice cold inside. As he was standing there, he turned around to look back towards his office. And then the elevator doors started to close. He said that for whatever reason, he didn't step out. He just decided to ride it out and see what happened. As soon as the doors closed, the button for the basement lit up, as if someone had pressed it. The elevator began its descent. He was just standing there thinking about how bizarre this all was. The elevator was malfunctioning with an alarm just a moment ago, and now, as soon as he got inside, it was working perfectly and taking him to the basement. The elevator reached the basement, and the doors opened. There was no one there. Blair said it took all of his courage, but he called out, "Hey, is anyone down here?" He was met with total silence. As soon as he realized no one was going to answer, he said he didn't want to make another sound. He was standing in the elevator in the middle of that long, dark basement hall with the piano sitting out in the middle of it. The lights in the hall were off, and the only light was spilling out from the elevator car. He poked his head out and looked one way. Nothing. He looked the other way. Nothing but the faint outline of the piano. At this point, he was completely spooked. He jumped back into the elevator and started frantically pressing the button for the third floor. He was hitting the door close button over and over. The doors finally shut, and the elevator took him back up to his office. He rushed into his office, shut the door behind him, and sat down at his desk, his mind racing. He was trying to rationalize what had just happened. As he was sitting there, trying to calm down, he heard a new noise. It sounded like banging, coming from just outside his office in the foyer area near the elevator. He got up, went to his door, and cautiously opened it. He peeked his head out and looked to the side. There was a big heavy metal filing cabinet there, and all of its drawers were pulled wide open. He definitely had not done that. And as he watched, one by one, the heavy drawers began to slam shut on their own. Bang. 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 One after another until the entire cabinet was closed. He walked over to it, trying to disprove what he had just seen. He thought maybe there was a problem with the drawers, that they would just shut on their own. But he opened one, and it stayed open. He had to physically push it for it to close. Something, or someone, had just slammed them all shut. That was it for him. He packed up his things, left the theater, and swore he would never work another night shift there again. Later that night, Dave told Morgan the story that Blair had shared with him. He wasn't sure how Morgan would react, if he'd be dismissive. But, to his surprise, Morgan opened up. He told Dave that long before Dave had started working there, he had always had this uncomfortable feeling in the theater, like he was constantly being watched. And then he reminded Dave of their shared experience with the slamming bathroom door and the lights on the second floor. Then Morgan told him about his solo shift. He described hearing the voices in the hall, the coughing from the basement, and the inexplicable smell of smoke when there was no fire. They started going back and forth, sharing all the strange, unsettling things they had experienced in that building. They both felt deeply uncomfortable there, and they realized they needed to do something. Dave came up with an idea. He said he had a best friend he could invite over one night. They would tell him they were just giving him a special behind-the-scenes tour of the historic theater. They wouldn't tell him about any of the strange events. They would just walk him through and see if he noticed anything, if he reacted to anything. It would be a way to see if they were just imagining things, to get an outside perspective. Morgan thought it was a good idea. So Dave called his best friend, a guy named Greg. Greg would later say he was a bit surprised to get an invitation for a late-night tour of the theater, but he was curious. Since it was his best friend asking, he agreed to come down and check it out. The next day, Greg showed up at the theater where Dave and Morgan were on shift. They started the tour. They showed him the main auditorium, the stage, the dressing rooms. Then they made their way down to the basement. Morgan went first and flipped on the lights. And instantly, both he and Dave saw it. A little way down the hall, on the left, one of the doors was standing open. This was a huge red flag. No doors were ever left open. Dave and Morgan immediately pushed Greg behind them for safety, and they both drew their pistols, aiming them at the open doorway. Greg stayed back as Dave and Morgan slowly and cautiously advanced down the hall towards the open door. They got right up to the doorway, preparing to push the door open and clear the room. But before they could touch it, the door slammed shut right in front of their faces. Greg, Dave, and Morgan all just stared at it, completely shocked. And before they could even process that, the door handle started rattling violently, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get out. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. The hallway was silent again. Dave and Morgan looked at each other and nodded. They had to go in. Greg was terrified of being left alone in the hallway, so he decided to follow them. The three of them entered the room, Dave and Morgan with their guns raised. It was a small storage room. They flipped on the light. There was no one there. Suddenly, Greg gasped and pointed to a corner of the room. He said, "Someone's sitting in the corner?" Dave and Morgan immediately swung their guns towards the corner, but there was nothing there. It was empty. Greg insisted. "I just saw someone sitting there," he said, his voice trembling. It looked like he had a hood on, like a sweatshirt. He was right there. Now, all three of them were completely freaked out. Dave and Morgan had brought Greg there hoping to disprove the strangeness, and instead, it had escalated. All three of them had seen a door slam shut, and Greg was now claiming to have seen a figure in the room. This scared them all badly. They quickly left the room, locked it, shut off the lights, and got out of the basement. Greg said he was done, and left immediately. Dave and Morgan were left standing there wondering what on earth they were supposed to do now. At this point, Dave and Morgan started reporting these strange occurrences. They didn't mention anything about ghosts or hauntings, of course. They framed it as a series of potential break-ins and security breaches. Eventually, the county agreed that something needed to be done and decided to install a brand new upgraded camera system inside the theater. These new cameras had infrared technology, which meant they could see much more clearly in the dark. The hope was that this new system would finally allow them to catch whoever was breaking in and causing all this trouble. The new cameras were installed on September 15th. That night, Morgan was working alone again. He was sitting in the control room, familiarizing himself with the new system, clicking through the different camera feeds, and testing out the new features. At some point, as he was looking at the monitor for the main auditorium, something caught his eye. It looked like someone might be sitting in one of the seats out in the middle of the empty theater. The camera was zoomed out so he couldn't get a clear look. And since it was his first time using these new cameras, he wasn't sure what was normal and what wasn't. He zoomed the camera in, trying to get a better look. He could now see it more clearly. It was a figure, and it seemed to be wearing a hood or some kind of shroud over its head. It was just sitting there, motionless. And then, it slowly started to turn its head from side to side. As it turned, he could see, clear as day, a set of eyes glowing in the infrared view. And before Morgan could even react, the figure just started to rise up into the air, floating straight up towards the ceiling until it completely disappeared from view. That was it for Morgan. He didn't investigate. He didn't go looking. He was done. He literally quit his job that day. That was his very last shift at the Capital City Theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan quit, Dave was now working alone at the theater. He was in the control room one night when suddenly he heard the sound of a piano playing. There was only one piano in the entire theater. The one in the basement. As a police officer, it was his job to protect the building. He knew he had to go down there and check it out. It could be an intruder. He left the control room, drew his weapon, and started walking towards the basement stairs. As he got closer, the piano music got louder and louder. He made his way down the steps, and just as he was about to round the corner into the main basement hallway, he heard a loud bang. It was the sound of the wooden guard that protects the piano keys slamming shut. And the music stopped. He turned the corner and looked down the long hallway. There was no one there. He flipped on the light. The hall was empty. At that moment, he knew he wasn't going to find anyone. He knew this was the same thing that had been causing all the mayhem in the theater for months. Dave had seen enough. He was done with this place. He went right back upstairs, locked himself in the control room, and stayed there until the end of his shift. The very next day, he went to his sergeant and said, "You can never put me back inside that theater or I will quit," and sure enough, he was transferred. For the next 2 months, the theater didn't have a full-time security officer. Different officers would come in for a few hours here and there, but no one was assigned there permanently. That is, until November 26th. The department found another officer, a veteran cop named Josh Thomas, who agreed to take the full-time post at the theater. On November 26th, Josh Thomas reported for his very first shift. Because there had been no permanent officer, there was no one there to show him the ropes. He was all alone in the theater. By pure coincidence, Dave happened to be on patrol in his car that night, and his route took him near the theater. At some point during the night, a call came over Dave's radio. It was Josh. He was calling for backup, saying someone had broken into the theater. Dave's heart sank. He knew it probably wasn't a break-in. He knew exactly what was going on in that building. He was the closest unit to the theater, and even though the last thing he ever wanted to do was go back there, he felt a sense of responsibility. He had to go and back Josh up. And if it was what he thought it was, he needed to be the one to explain to this new officer what he was getting himself into. When Dave arrived at the theater, he went to the back door they always used. He saw Josh standing just outside the building. Dave would later say that Josh's eyes were as wide as saucers. He looked absolutely terrified. Dave walked over to him and asked what was going on, if the intruder was still inside. Josh explained that he had been doing his security rounds when he heard what sounded like voices coming from the basement. He checked all the rooms, but everything was secure. Then, as he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had turned on. It was coming up from the basement. The light was on, and he could hear it whirring. When the elevator doors opened on his floor, there was no one there. He stood there looking at the empty car, and then the door obstruction alarm started going off. That's when he called for backup. Dave looked at him and said, "Look, let's just go search the building. We'll do it together." They went inside and cleared the entire theater, floor by floor. Of course, they found no one. Before Dave left, they went into the main auditorium and stood on the stage, just talking. Dave's back was to the audience seats, and Josh was facing him. Suddenly, in the middle of a sentence, Josh just stopped talking. He froze, and he was staring at something just over Dave's shoulder. Dave asked, "What is it?" And Josh, his voice barely a whisper, said, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turned around. And as soon as he did, he saw what Josh was looking at. Standing in the very back of the dark theater, in a corner, was a man. His hands were by his sides, and his back was to them. He seemed to be looking down, and he had a hood pulled over his head. Dave turned his whole body to face this figure. And right as he did, the figure whipped around and looked directly at them. It had deep, dark, sunken eyes. Its face looked as if it had been horribly burned. It was black and charred. It stared at them for a second, and then it turned and ran out of a door at the back of the theater. Josh was convinced they had just seen the intruder. Dave was fairly certain they had just seen the entity that haunted the theater. They searched the entire building again, but they never found the cloaked figure. That was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room. He told him everything. He told him about the slamming doors, the voices, the smoke. He told him Blair's story about the elevator and the filing cabinets. He told him why Morgan had quit and why he himself had quit. Josh was now up to speed. Great, he thought. I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time Dave would ever set foot in the Capital City Theater. But his curiosity got the better of him. He started doing some research into the history of the building, and what he found was chilling. It turned out that back in the 1940s, there had been a horrible fire in the theater. A man had been trapped in the basement when the fire erupted. He had died down there. Dave shared this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them, all police officers, all trained to look in strong logical explanations, came to believe the same thing. They believed that what they had been witnessing, what they had seen and heard, was the ghost of the man who died in that fire all those years ago. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When we think of missing persons cases, we usually think of a search that ends in a quiet courtroom or a grim discovery in the woods. We think of the police tracking down clues, examining evidence, and trying to reconstruct what happened to someone who simply vanished off the face of the earth. But sometimes, the reality of a disappearance is far more complex and unbelievable than any investigator could ever write in a report. Sometimes, when a person goes missing, they are not victims of a crime, but are instead locked in a quiet, desperate battle against the most hostile environments on our planet. Today, we are going to look at 3 of the most incredible survival stories in human history where search teams looked for clues, found nothing, and officially declared these people dead, only for the missing to pull off the absolute impossible. Our first story begins in the spring of 1994 with a 39-year-old Italian man named Mauro Prosperi. Mauro was an incredibly accomplished police officer from Rome, but he was also a world-class athlete who had competed as an Olympic pentathlete. He was a man who lived for physical challenges, someone who believed that the human body was a machine capable of overcoming any obstacle if you had enough mental discipline. He decided to test this theory by signing up for the Marathon des Sables, which translates to the Marathon of the Sands. This event was widely regarded as the single toughest foot race on the face of the earth. It was a 6-day, 155-mile endurance run straight through the heart of the Sahara Desert in Morocco. The rules of the race were brutal. There were no aid stations with sports drinks or energy gels. Every runner had to carry all of their own food, sleeping gear, medical supplies, and emergency equipment in a heavy backpack. The race organizers only provided a limited amount of fresh water at specific checkpoints along the route, and that was it. The Sahara Desert was so dangerous and unpredictable that before anyone was even allowed to stand at the starting line, they had to sign a very specific document. This document was not just a basic liability waiver. It actually required each participant to write down the exact address where they wanted their body to be shipped in the event that they did not survive the race. To prepare for this terrifying challenge, Mauro had spent months training in a way that most people would find completely insane. He ran 25 miles every single day, often in the peak afternoon heat. To get his body accustomed to the devastating effects of extreme dehydration, he would purposely restrict his water intake during these training runs, forcing himself to keep going on just a few sips of water. He wanted to make sure his mind and body were completely bulletproof before he stepped onto the Saharan sands. But despite his incredible athletic resume and his rigorous preparation, his wife was absolutely terrified. She knew how deadly the Sahara could be, and she begged him to reconsider. But Mauro was confident, even dismissive of the danger. He smiled and told her that the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to him out there was that he would get a little sunburned. The race kicked off at its starting point in Morocco on April 10th, 1994, under a blazing desert sun. Initially, everything went exactly according to Mauro's plan. He was in peak physical condition, easily keeping pace with the frontrunners of the pack. He was consistently the very first Italian runner to cross the finish line at the end of each daily stage. The event felt less like a survival struggle and more like an exciting adventure. Every afternoon, when Mauro would finish his daily run, he would set up his tent, hang an Italian flag outside the entrance, and wait for his fellow Italian competitors to arrive so they could hang out, chat, and drink tea. He would later say that this initial part of the race was actually some of the most fun he had ever had. But the desert has a way of turning on people when they least expect it, and Mauro's luck was about to run out in the most terrifying way possible. On the 4th day of the race, the competitors set out for the longest and most difficult phase of the entire marathon. This was a massive 50-mile stretch of deep sand dunes and barren gravel plains. When Morrow began running that morning, he noticed that the wind was already starting to pick up, blowing fine grains of sand across the track. As the hours passed, the wind grew stronger, and Morrow found himself navigating a narrow valley situated between two massive sand dunes. Because he was running at such a fast pace, the main group of runners had fallen far behind him, and the absolute elite pace setters were miles ahead. Morrow was completely alone in the silent, baking desert. And then, out of nowhere, the wind suddenly intensified into a roaring gale, kicking up a massive sandstorm. Within seconds, a thick wall of swirling yellow dust and sand completely engulfed him, blotting out the sun and reducing his visibility to absolutely zero. Morrow could not see his own hands in front of his face. The tiny, sharp grains of sand whipped against his skin like thousands of miniature needles, and every time he tried to breathe, his lungs filled with dust. He knew that if he kept running, he would easily wander off the path and become hopelessly lost. He managed to grope around in the blinding storm until his hands brushed against a large rock formation. He quickly huddled down behind the rock, pulling his head down, wrapping a scarf tightly around his face, and decided that his best option was simply to wait out the storm. He assumed it would pass in an hour or two, and then he could get right back on the trail and continue his run. But the sandstorm did not stop. It raged violently for 8 consecutive hours, burying Morrow under a thick layer of shifting sand as he lay trapped behind the rock. By the time the wind finally died down and the air cleared, the sun had already set, leaving the desert in pitch-black darkness. At this point, Morrow was not particularly worried about his survival. He was an elite athlete and a police officer trained to handle stress. His biggest concern was actually his placement in the race. He had been in 4th place overall when the storm hit, and he was incredibly frustrated that this massive setback was going to ruin his timing. He went to sleep on the open sand that night, thinking about how he was going to wake up at the very first light of dawn and run as fast as humanly possible to make up for the lost time so he would not finish last. But when the sun rose the next morning, Morrow stood up, looked around, and realized that he had a much bigger problem than his race placement. The sandstorm had been so incredibly powerful that it had completely altered the entire geography of the area. The massive sand dunes that had served as his landmarks the day before had literally shifted and moved, transforming the landscape into a completely unrecognizable sea of sand. Morrow had a compass and a map in his backpack, but they were completely useless to him because he had absolutely no reference points to orient himself. He had no idea which direction he had been running before the storm, and he had no idea where the next checkpoint was. To make matters worse, the race rules required participants to be largely self-sufficient between major checkpoints, meaning Morrow only had a very limited amount of water with him. He had about half a bottle of water left in his pack. The way the race worked was that organizers would distribute fresh bottles of water at each designated checkpoint during the day, with the expectation that runners would drink all of it before reaching the next stop. Because Morrow had been trapped by the storm before reaching the afternoon checkpoint, his water supply was critically low. As he stood there in the quiet desert, Morrow tried to stay calm. He reasoned that other runners must have been caught in the exact same sandstorm. Surely they were also waking up right now, looking around and trying to find their way. He figured all he had to do was find a high vantage point, spot another runner, and they could team up to navigate back to safety. With this plan in mind, Morrow ran up to the crest of a nearby sand dune and scanned the horizon in every direction. But there was nothing. The desert was completely empty, silent, and still. He ran down that dune and sprinted up another one, hoping for a better view. Again, there was only an endless expanse of barren sand. Over the next several hours, Morrow grew increasingly panicked. He spent the hottest hours of the day running from the top of one dune to another, frantically searching for any sign of human life. In doing so, he made a critical mistake. He was sweating profusely under the blazing sun, expending a massive amount of energy and burning through his final drops of water. By late afternoon, with his throat burning and his body trembling from exhaustion, Morrow realized that if he kept running around like this, he was going to die of heat stroke within 24 hours. He stopped, took a deep breath, and forced himself to go into survival mode. He knew that to conserve what little moisture he had left in his body, he had to stop moving during the heat of the day. He decided that from that moment on, he would only travel during the cool hours of the night and the very early morning when the temperature dropped. To prepare for the absolute worst-case scenario, Morrow began urinating into his empty water bottles, saving his own urine to drink later when his fresh water was completely gone. Over the next 2 days, Morrow slowly drifted through the desert, walking in what he hoped was the right direction, but he had no way of knowing if he was making any real progress. He saw nothing but sand, sky, and heat shimmer. His tongue began to swell, and his lips cracked and bled. Then, on the 3rd day of his ordeal, Morrow saw something strange on the horizon. It looked like a small structure. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a mirage, but as he drew closer, he realized it was real. It was a small Muslim shrine, a stone structure built in the middle of the empty desert that nomadic Bedouins would use for shelter as they traveled. Morrow ran inside, desperately hoping to find a living person who could help him. But when he stepped into the dim interior, the only person there was a long-dead holy man resting inside a wooden coffin. Despite the presence of the corpse, Morrow was incredibly relieved. He finally had shelter from the brutal, direct sunlight. He sat down in the shade of the stone walls and took stock of his surroundings. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he looked up at the ceiling and noticed that the wooden rafters of the shrine were completely covered with hundreds of small, sleeping bats. Morrow was starving and dangerously dehydrated. His survival instincts took over. He climbed up into the rafters, reached out, and began grabbing the bats by the handful. He wrung their necks, peeled back their skin, and began drinking their warm blood directly from their bodies to get some form of liquid into his system. He also ate their raw meat. In total, Morrow killed and consumed 20 bats inside that shrine, which gave him just enough strength to keep going. Outside the shrine, Morrow found some dry wood. He decided to build a fire and keep it burning, hoping that the smoke would act as a signal for the search planes and helicopters that he assumed were looking for him. Back at the race headquarters, the organizers had indeed realized that Morrow was missing. They had contacted the Moroccan military, and a massive search operation had been launched. Search parties and off-road vehicles were scouring the desert, and military aircraft were flying patterns over the vast sands. But the Sahara is immense, and finding a single human being in millions of square miles of sand is like finding a needle in a haystack. Over the next 4 days, Morrow stayed at the shrine, keeping his fire going. On 3 separate occasions, he heard the distant sound of an engine and looked up to see a plane or a helicopter flying directly over his location. Each time, Morrow ran outside, waving his arms wildly, screaming at the top of his lungs, and throwing fresh brush onto the fire to create thick plumes of black smoke. But the pilots, flying high above the shimmering desert heat, never saw him. They flew right past, their engines fading into the distance. After the 3rd plane disappeared over the horizon, Morrow fell to his knees in absolute despair. He had been lost in the desert for nearly a week. His food was gone, he was out of water, and he realized that nobody was coming to save him. Faced with the prospect of a slow, agonizing death from dehydration and starvation under the desert sun, Morrow decided to take control of his own fate. He was a practical man, and he wanted to make sure his family was taken care of. He knew that if he died out in the open desert, the shifting sands would quickly cover his body, and he would never be found. If his body was never recovered, the Italian authorities would declare him a missing person, and it would take years for his wife to receive his police pension. But if he died inside the stone shrine, his body would eventually be found by passing Bedouins, providing closure and financial security for his family. Maro took a piece of charcoal from his signal fire and wrote a long, emotional farewell message to his wife on the stone wall of the shrine. Then he took his knife, cut his wrist deep, and lay down on the dirt floor, closing his eyes and waiting for death to take him. But the next morning, Maro opened his eyes. He was still alive. He looked down at his wrists and saw that they had barely bled at all. His body was so severely dehydrated that his blood had become incredibly thick and viscous, clotting almost instantly in the wounds and preventing him from bleeding to death. Maro stared at his wrists in disbelief. He took this as a powerful, unmistakable sign from the universe that he was not meant to die in that desert. He felt a sudden, intense surge of motivation. He was going to survive, no matter what it took. He stood up, packed his gear, and remembered a piece of advice that one of the veteran race organizers had given the runners before the start of the marathon. The organizer had told them that if they ever got hopelessly lost in the desert, they should look toward the horizon at dawn and find the small, low-lying clouds that form there. Those clouds, the organizer said, indicate the presence of moisture and vegetation, and if you follow them, they will eventually lead you to civilization. Maro looked out at the horizon, spotted a line of faint clouds in the distance, and began walking directly toward them. For days, Maro marched across the blistering sand dunes. His mind entered a primal, animalistic state focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other. Whenever he saw a lizard or a snake scuttling across the sand, he would pounce on it, kill it, and eat it raw on the spot. His tongue was so swollen and dry that he could no longer produce saliva, making it almost impossible to swallow the dry meat, but he forced it down anyway. When he could no longer urinate, he began searching dried-up riverbeds for wild succulents. He would cut the plants open and suck the bitter, moist sap from their stems. He even resorted to pulling the wet wipes out of his backpack and sucking the chemical moisture out of them just to wet his mouth. On the 9th day of his ordeal, Maro was shuffling across a gravel plain when he saw a small figure in the distance. As he drew closer, he realized it was a young shepherd girl tending to a small herd of goats. When the girl looked up and saw Maro, she was absolutely terrified. He looked like a living corpse. His skin was blackened and burned by the sun, his clothes were tattered and covered in dirt, his eyes were sunken deep into his skull, and he had lost over 30 pounds of body weight. The girl screamed and ran away as fast as she could. Maro was too weak to chase after her, and he sank to the ground, devastated that his one chance at rescue was running away. But the girl had actually run back to her nomadic tribe's camp to tell them about the strange, ghostly man in the desert. A few minutes later, several men from the tribe came riding over the dunes. They wrapped Maro in blankets, placed him on a camel, and brought him back to their camp. They gently gave him goat's milk and water, nursing him until local authorities could be contacted. When the police finally arrived to pick Maro up and took him to a hospital, they realized something absolutely shocking. Maro had walked over 181 miles from where he had originally gotten lost during the race. He had crossed the entire border of Morocco and had walked deep into the territory of neighboring Algeria. Back in Morocco, the search parties had called off their rescue efforts days ago. The only clue they had ever found was a single, discarded shoelace belonging to Maro, and they had officially concluded that he had perished in the sand. His family was preparing for his funeral when they received the unbelievable phone call that he was alive in an Algerian hospital. It would take Maro 2 full years of intense medical treatment and physical therapy to fully recover from the damage his organs suffered during those 9 days in the desert. But his spirit was never broken. Once he was fully healed, Maro returned to the sport he loved, ultimately going on to complete 8 more extreme desert ultramarathons. Our second story of incredible survival takes us away from the hot, dry sands of the Sahara and drops us right into the middle of the vast open water of the Pacific Ocean. The date was November 17th, 2012, and we are off the coast of Chiapas, Mexico. A 35-year-old man named Jose Salvador Alvarenga was preparing for a deep-sea fishing trip. Jose was an incredibly experienced commercial fisherman who had spent years working on the water. He knew how to handle boats, he knew how to read the weather, and he knew exactly where to find the most valuable fish in the deep ocean. On this particular day, Jose had volunteered to take on a grueling 30-hour shift for his fishing company. He was hoping to catch a massive haul of sharks, marlins, and sailfish, which were highly lucrative. Normally, Jose went out to sea with his regular fishing partner, a seasoned professional who could handle any situation. But at the very last minute, his partner had to back out of the trip. Jose was determined to go anyway, so he looked around the docks for anyone else who was willing to work. The only person available was a 23-year-old named Ezequiel Cordoba. Ezequiel was the complete opposite of Jose. He was young, extremely inexperienced, and had never been out on a deep-sea fishing trip before. Jose knew that Ezequiel would not be of much help if things got rough, but he figured that since it was only a short 30-hour trip and they would not be traveling too far from the shoreline, nothing major could go wrong. He agreed to take the young rookie along. The two men climbed aboard Jose's 24-foot fiberglass skiff. The boat was a simple, open-hulled vessel equipped with a small outboard motor, a radio, various fishing lines, and a massive insulated icebox to hold their catch. They pushed off from the Mexican shore and headed out into the ocean. At first, their trip was an absolute success. Within just a few hours of dropping their lines, they hit a massive school of fish. They were pulling in valuable sharks and marlins one after the other, and the giant icebox was quickly filling up to maximum capacity. Their luck was so incredible that they lost track of time. In the late afternoon, Jose noticed a dark line of heavy clouds forming on the horizon, signaling an approaching storm. A seasoned fisherman would normally pack up and head back to port immediately. But Jose and Ezequiel were having the run of their lives, and they decided to wait and catch just a few more fish before heading back. This decision would prove to be a fatal mistake. The storm that was rolling in was not a typical tropical squall. It was a massive, historically violent weather system. By the time Jose finally started up the outboard motor and turned the skiff toward the Mexican coast, the storm was already upon them. The rain began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets, completely obscuring the coastline and reducing their visibility to just a few feet. The wind howled, and the waves quickly grew into towering walls of water that battered the small fiberglass boat. Jose tried to use his compass to navigate, but the wind and currents were too strong. To make matters worse, the skiff was incredibly heavy, loaded down with nearly 1,000 pounds of freshly caught fish. The boat was sitting dangerously low in the water, taking on waves with every passing minute. Realizing they were in imminent danger of sinking, Jose shouted to Ezequiel that they had to lighten the load. Together, they began tossing their valuable catch back into the ocean, watching 1,000 pounds of hard-earned fish disappear into the dark, churning waves. Even with the lightened boat, they could make no progress against the storm. The wind was pushing them further and further away from the safety of the shore. Realizing that fighting the waves was burning through their limited fuel, Jose made the difficult decision to shut down the engine. He told Ezequiel that their best chance of survival was to simply ride out the storm, letting the boat drift until the weather cleared, and then they would use their remaining fuel to navigate back to land. But the storm did not end. It continued to rage with terrifying intensity for 5 straight days. The two men were trapped in a living nightmare. The torrential rain never stopped, the wind screamed, and the boat was constantly tossed up and down by massive waves. They had no shelter on the open skiff, and they were constantly soaked and shivering from the cold. Because they had only planned to be out for 30 hours, they had brought very little food and water, which they quickly exhausted. Fortunately, the heavy rain allowed them to collect some drinking water in empty containers, but they had absolutely nothing to eat. By the time the storm finally broke on the sixth day, the sky cleared to reveal a terrifying reality. They were completely lost in the middle of the vast, empty Pacific Ocean. The damage to their boat was catastrophic. The violent waves had completely ripped the outboard motor off the transom, and it was gone. Their electronics were completely fried by the saltwater, and most of their fishing gear had been swept overboard. The only thing they had left was a small handheld radio. Jose turned it on and realized there was just a tiny bit of battery power left. He quickly broadcasted a frantic Mayday message to his boss back on the mainland, giving their last known coordinates and explaining that they were drifting without a motor. But before he could get a confirmation or a response, the radio battery died completely. Back on land, Jose's boss immediately contacted the Mexican authorities and search parties were launched. Helicopters, planes, and rescue boats searched the ocean waters off the coast of Chiapas for several days. But the ocean is vast, and the strong currents had already pulled the light fiberglass skiff far away from the search grid. During the search, rescuers discovered some broken pieces of fiberglass floating in the ocean that matched the color of Jose's boat. Believing the skiff had capsized and disintegrated in the historic storm, the authorities called off the search. The families of Jose and Ezekiel were notified that the men were lost at sea and presumed dead. Memorial services were held, and the community mourned their tragic passing. But out on the open ocean, the two men were still very much alive, drifting slowly westward. As the days turned into weeks, they had to quickly adapt to their new, hostile environment. Jose's lifetime of fishing experience became their greatest asset. He figured out how to use his bare hands to catch small sea turtles that swam near the boat. He would lean over the side, grab them by their shells, and haul them aboard. They would crack the shells open, eat the raw meat, and drink the warm turtle blood, which provided them with crucial hydration and nutrients. Jose also learned to catch small fish that hid under the shadow of the boat, and he would grab seabirds that landed on the skiff's edges, wringing their necks and eating them raw. Whenever it rained, they would collect the water in empty containers, but during the long, dry spells, they had to resort to drinking their own urine and turtle blood to survive. Jose tried his best to stay positive, constantly telling Ezekiel that they would eventually drift into a shipping lane and be spotted by a commercial cargo ship, or that they would eventually hit land. He kept track of the passage of time by carefully monitoring the cycles and phases of the moon, scratching marks into the side of the boat. But while Jose was mentally tough and adapted to the brutal routine, young Ezekiel was completely falling apart. He had never been out on the ocean like this, and the constant movement of the boat, the blazing sun, and the horrific diet of raw meat and blood began to take a severe psychological toll on him. He fell into a state of profound catatonic depression. By the fourth month of their drift, Ezekiel's body began to reject the raw turtle and bird meat. Every time he tried to swallow a piece, he would immediately become violently ill, throwing up what little moisture he had left. He grew weaker by the day, and eventually, he simply gave up. He refused to eat, despite Jose's desperate pleas and attempts to force feed him. In early 2013, Ezekiel Cordoba closed his eyes and died of starvation and dehydration. Ezekiel's death was a crushing blow to Jose. Even though the young man had not been able to help with the physical survival tasks, his presence had kept Jose sane. He was someone to talk to, someone to share the burden of their terrifying reality. Now, Jose was completely alone in the middle of the infinite ocean. He fell into a deep, dark depression. For 6 consecutive days, Jose could not bring himself to touch Ezekiel's body. He simply sat on the opposite side of the small skiff, staring at his deceased friend, talking to him as if he were still alive. He even contemplated jumping overboard to end his own life, but on the 7th day, a sudden wave of clarity washed over Jose. He realized that if he did not dispose of the body, it would begin to decay and bring disease, ending his own chances of survival. He stood up, said a quiet prayer of farewell, and gently pushed Ezekiel's body into the deep blue water of the Pacific. From that moment on, Jose became laser-focused on one thing: survival. He spent his days catching birds, tracking the moon, and conserving his energy. He would survive like this, completely alone in the open ocean, for another 9 grueling months. Then, on January 30th, 2014, after drifting for an unbelievable 14 months and traveling over 6,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, Jose looked out and saw a tiny sliver of green on the horizon. It was land. He had drifted all the way to the remote Ibon Atoll, a tiny part of the Marshall Islands. Weak, emaciated, and barely able to stand, Jose managed to steer his boat close to the reef, leaped into the water, and swam ashore. He stumbled onto a beach and saw a small wooden hut. He knocked on the door, and a local couple opened it to find a wild-looking man with long matted hair, a thick beard, and wearing nothing but a tattered pair of underwear. The couple was absolutely stunned. They took him in, gave him water and food, and contacted the local authorities. Word quickly spread around the world that a Mexican fisherman had just washed up on a remote island after being lost at sea for over a year. When Jose's family in Mexico received the news, they were in absolute disbelief. They had spent over a year mourning his death, and now he was suddenly alive on the other side of the planet. But when Jose returned to Mexico, his incredible story of survival was met with an unexpected wave of skepticism and suspicion. Many people, including several journalists and medical experts, openly accused him of fabricating the entire ordeal. They pointed out that when he was first rescued, he did not look like someone who had been starving on a boat for 14 months. He was somewhat heavy, and his skin was not as severely damaged as they expected. Furthermore, they argued that it was medically impossible for a human to survive that long without developing scurvy, a deadly disease caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, which is found in fresh fruits and vegetables. However, medical experts who thoroughly examined Jose quickly debunked these claims. They explained that a diet consisting entirely of raw sea turtles, fish, and seabirds actually contains high levels of vitamin C, particularly in the eyes, livers, and blood of the animals, which Jose had consumed. This unique diet had kept scurvy at bay. Additionally, oceanographers and researchers at the University of Hawaii ran a series of advanced computer simulations using historical wind and current data from late 2012 to early 2014. The results were clear. An unpowered boat drifting from the coast of Mexico would be carried by the North Equatorial Current directly to the Marshall Islands, exactly where Jose had washed ashore. The most painful challenge for Jose came when the family of Ezekiel Cordoba filed a massive lawsuit against him. They accused Jose of murdering their son and eating his body to survive those 14 months at sea. They claimed that this was the only logical explanation for how Jose had managed to stay so well nourished while their son had supposedly starved to death. Jose was deeply hurt by these accusations, as he had tried everything in his power to save the young man. To prove his innocence, Jose agreed to undergo multiple comprehensive lie detector tests administered by independent forensic experts. He passed every single test with physical indicators proving his absolute honesty, confirming that he had never harmed Ezekiel and had only disposed of his body after he had naturally passed away. Today, Jose lives a quiet, isolated life in a small, landlocked town in El Salvador. He refuses to go anywhere near the ocean, terrified of the vast blue water that kept him prisoner for over a year. Our third and final story of survival takes us to the skies above South America and then deep into the dense, dark interior of the Amazon rainforest. The date was December 24th, 1971, and a 17-year-old German girl named Juliane Kepke was standing in the busy airport terminal in Lima, Peru. Juliane had just graduated from high school, and she was traveling with her mother, Maria. They were waiting to board a flight to the jungle city of Pucallpa, where Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm Kopke, was waiting for them. Her father was a famous zoologist who ran a remote research station deep in the Amazon, and the family was looking forward to spending Christmas together. The airport was completely packed with holiday travelers, and everyone was incredibly frustrated because their flight, Lanza Flight 508, was running over 7 hours late. The delay was caused by severe turbulent weather conditions over the Andes Mountains, which made flying extremely dangerous. Many passengers were complaining and demanding refunds, but Juliane and her mother were just anxious to get home, so they decided to wait. Finally, the flight was cleared for departure, and the passengers boarded the Lockheed Electra turboprop aircraft. Shortly after takeoff, the plane began to encounter moderate turbulence as it climbed into the cloudy Peruvian sky. Juliane, who had flown many times before, actually found the gentle shaking of the plane to be somewhat exciting. Her mother, however, was highly nervous, gripping the armrest tightly with white knuckles. As the plane flew higher, heading directly into a massive active thunderstorm, the turbulence grew progressively worse. Within minutes, the aircraft was being violently tossed around like a toy in the sky. The shaking became so intense that the overhead luggage compartments burst open, sending heavy suitcases, wrapped Christmas presents, and holiday cakes tumbling down into the aisle, causing passengers to scream in terror. Juliane's excitement quickly turned to absolute dread. She looked out the window and saw brilliant, blinding flashes of lightning illuminating the dark storm clouds right next to the wings. The plane felt like it was being lifted 50 feet in the air and then suddenly dropped into a free fall over and over again. And then there was an incredibly loud, metallic bang that echoed through the cabin, accompanied by a blinding flash of light that turned the entire interior of the plane stark white. Instantly, all the cabin lights went out, plunging the passengers into darkness. Juliane looked out the left window and saw thick black smoke and bright orange flames pouring out of the engine on the wing. The plane entered a steep, near-vertical nosedive, screaming toward the earth at hundreds of miles per hour. Amidst the deafening roar of the engines and the terrified screams of 90 passengers, Juliane's mother turned to her, grabbed her hand tightly, and whispered her final words. "This is it. It's all over." The next thing Juliane knew, the chaotic noise of the cabin vanished. It was replaced by a strange, rushing sound of wind. She opened her eyes and realized she was no longer inside the airplane. She was outside, suspended in the air, still strapped securely to her row of 3 passenger seats. The plane had disintegrated in mid-air at an altitude of over 2 miles. Juliane was in a state of freefall, plummeting 10,000 feet toward the dense canopy of the Amazon jungle below. She watched the green tops of the trees rushing up to meet her, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound loneliness as she fell through the sky. And then she lost consciousness. When Juliane woke up the next day, she was lying on the wet jungle floor. She looked up at the sky through a small gap in the thick canopy above, and the very first words she spoke out loud were, "I survived." She tried to stand, but her body was in immense pain. She had suffered a broken collarbone, a concussion, a deep bleeding gash in her leg, and a swollen, blackened eye. She had also lost her glasses during the fall, and because she was extremely nearsighted, the entire jungle around her was a blurry green haze. She was wearing only a sleeveless summer mini dress, and she had lost one of her flip-flops during the fall. She began shouting for her mother, her voice echoing through the dense forest. But there was no reply, only the chatter of birds and insects. She was completely alone. Back in Lima, when Flight 508 disappeared from military radar, a massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched. Over the next several days, dozens of search planes and helicopters flew patterns over the vast, dense Amazon rainforest, trying to locate the crash site. But the triple canopy jungle of the Amazon is so incredibly thick and overgrown that it acted like a giant green blanket, completely hiding the wreckage from the air. The pilots could see nothing but endless treetops. Ground search teams tried to cut their way through the thick jungle, but the terrain was so hostile, filled with swamps and steep terrain, that progress was agonizingly slow. The authorities eventually began to lose hope, believing that all 91 passengers had died on impact and that the jungle had swallowed them whole. But Julianne was determined to live. She had a major advantage that most teenagers did not. She had spent the last year and a half living with her parents at their remote Amazonian research station. Her parents had taught her the vital rules of jungle survival. She knew that the most important thing she had to do was find water. Her father had once told her that if you ever get lost in the jungle, you must find a stream, follow it to a larger river, and eventually that river will lead you to civilization. Julianne found her single remaining flip-flop and placed it on her foot. Because she could not see clearly, she used her bare foot to feel for tree roots and mud, while using her foot with the flip-flop to test the ground ahead of her for venomous snakes or hidden sinkholes before taking a step. She began crawling and stumbling through the thick undergrowth until she heard the faint, beautiful sound of trickling water. She followed the sound and discovered a tiny stream. Instead of walking along the muddy banks of the stream, which were covered in dense foliage, thorns, and fallen logs, Julianne stepped directly into the water and began wading down the middle of the stream. Her parents had taught her that predators like jaguars, wild boars, and venomous spiders are much more likely to hunt and hide on the banks, and that walking in the water was far safer even if it meant dealing with piranhas and stingrays. A short distance down the stream, Julianne came across a small section of the plane's wreckage. It was a piece of the fuselage, but there were no survivors there. The only useful thing she found was a small plastic bag of hard candy. She took the bag, popped a candy into her mouth, and kept walking. For several days, Julianne slowly made her way down the winding stream. The daytime heat was oppressive, and the air was thick with clouds of biting mosquitoes and flies that swarmed her open wounds. At night, the temperature dropped, and because she was wearing only a thin mini dress, she would shiver uncontrollably on the damp ground, unable to sleep. She would later say that the nights were the most terrifying part of her ordeal as she lay in pitch-black darkness, listening to the strange roaring cries of unknown predators moving through the trees around her. On the fourth day of her journey, Julianne heard a sound that made her heart stop. It was the loud, heavy flapping of wings and the harsh, guttural croaking of a king vulture. Having lived in the jungle, she knew exactly what that sound meant. King vultures only gather when there is a large amount of decaying meat nearby. She knew that just around the next bend of the stream lay the bodies of her fellow passengers, and she was terrified that she was about to find her own mother. She slowly rounded the corner and saw a horrific sight. A row of 3 passenger seats had landed headfirst in the soft mud with such immense force that the bodies of the passengers were buried chest deep in the earth with only their legs sticking out into the air. Julianne approached the wreckage, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and grief. She examined the feet of one of the female passengers, looking to see if it was her mother. She noticed that the woman's toenails were painted a bright pink. Julianne knew that her mother never painted her toenails, and she felt an immediate, overwhelming wave of relief that this corpse was not her mother. But almost instantly, she felt a deep sense of shame and guilt for feeling happy in the presence of such tragedy. She searched the area for food or supplies, but found nothing. She said a silent prayer for the dead and continued her journey down the stream. By the 10th day, Julianne's physical condition had deteriorated dangerously. She had finished her bag of candy days ago and had not eaten anything since. Her broken collarbone throbbed with every step, and the deep gash on her leg had become severely infected. But the most horrifying development was a wound on her right arm. A blowfly had laid eggs in the open cut, and the wound was now completely infested with dozens of live, crawling maggots that were eating her flesh. She was so weak that she could no longer walk, so she allowed herself to drift with the current of the river, which had grown wider and deeper. As she floated down the river, she suddenly saw something that she thought was a hallucination caused by her fever and starvation. Up on the muddy bank sat a large wooden boat with an outboard motor attached to it. Julianne slowly swam to the bank, dragged herself out of the water, and touched the side of the boat. It was real. She looked up and saw a small, narrow pathway leading from the boat into the jungle. She dragged herself up the path and found a small, empty wooden hut used by local lumbermen. Inside the hut, Julianne found a small plastic jug containing gasoline. She remembered a time back at her parents' research station when their dog had developed a maggot infestation and a wound, and her father had used gasoline to successfully extract them. Julianne poured the harsh burning fuel directly into the deep wound on her arm. She screamed in agony as the gasoline burned her raw flesh, but the chemical reaction forced the maggots to crawl to the surface of her skin. With her remaining strength, Julianne painstakingly pulled 30 large maggots out of her arm one by one. Exhausted and in excruciating pain, she crawled onto the floor of the hut and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Julianne woke up to the sound of human voices. She looked toward the doorway and saw 3 Peruvian forest workers walking up the path. When the men saw Julianne, they stopped in their tracks, paralyzed with fear. Julianne was incredibly pale, with long blonde hair, and she was wearing a tattered, dirty dress. The local men believed in a famous jungle legend about a water goddess, a half-woman, half-mermaid spirit who was pale-skinned and would lure men to their deaths in the river. They thought they were looking at a ghost. Julianne spoke to them in perfect Spanish, explaining that she was a human, a passenger from the plane that had crashed a week and a half ago, and that she desperately needed help. The men immediately realized she was telling the truth. They washed her wounds, gave her some food and clean water, and let her rest. The following day, they placed her in their boat and took her on a several-hour journey down the river to a small local town, where she was rushed to a clinic. The very next day, Julianne was reunited with her father, who had traveled to the area to join the search efforts. When he walked into her hospital room, he was so completely overwhelmed with emotion, having believed his entire family was dead, that he simply collapsed by her bed and could not speak for hours. Julianne was the sole survivor of the 91 people who had boarded Lanza Flight 508 on Christmas Eve. A few weeks after her rescue, search teams finally located the main crash site deep in the jungle. There, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Julianne's mother had actually survived the initial 2-mile fall as well, landing in a different part of the forest with severe injuries. But because she was unable to move and the search planes could not see through the thick canopy, she had survived for several agonizing days alone in the dark before finally succumbing to her wounds. This tragic detail would haunt Julianne and her father for the rest of their lives, leaving them with the painful knowledge of how close they had come to saving her. Julianne recovered from her physical injuries and went on to study biology, just like her parents. But she would always carry the heavy, silent burden of being the girl who fell from the sky and survived the green hell of the Amazon. These 3 incredible stories of survival remind us of the sheer, unbreakable power of the human spirit. In the face of absolute despair, when all hope of rescue had vanished, these individuals did not give up. They adapted, they fought, and they found a way to make it back to the world. Their experiences show us that sometimes the line between life and death is not just a matter of luck, but a matter of pure, unyielding will. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Think about the last time something happened to you that felt too precise to be an accident. Maybe it was small. You thought of someone you hadn't spoken to in years, and they called that afternoon. Maybe it was slightly stranger than that. Or maybe, if you're honest, there was one moment in your life that you still can't fully explain. One moment where the timing was so exact, the collision of two separate paths so perfectly arranged that the idea of pure randomness starts to feel almost naive. The 5 stories you're about to hear are not small coincidences. One of them is about a father and a daughter, both looking for each other on the same street on the same afternoon, captured together in a single photograph neither of them knew was being taken. One is about a man who told Hollywood he was nobody and accidentally convinced the right person that he was exactly who they needed. One is about a man who has been swallowed by the ocean, by the jungle, by sharks, and eventually by a whale, and who keeps walking back out. One is about a sheriff on a plane in a snowstorm who looked out his window at exactly the right second and saved a man who did not deserve to be saved. One is about a stranger who got into the wrong truck and ended up destroying the one life that had nothing to do with any of it. 5 stories. 5 moments where you'll ask yourself, what are the odds? But here's the thing about that question. Sometimes the answer is beautiful. Sometimes the answer is that the universe quietly intervened and 2 people found each other after a decade of searching. And sometimes the answer is that the same impossible precision, the same 1 in a trillion alignment of time and place puts a monster exactly where he needs to be. The odds don't care which outcome you're hoping for. They just land where they land. Let's get into it. If you're someone who likes strange, dark, and mysterious stories told like a film, you are in exactly the right place. That is all we do here, and we upload once a week. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's go. In 2007, a 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a quiet life in Bow, East London, with his wife and 2 daughters. He had spent most of his working years as a carpenter, and now, semi-retired, he spent the bulk of his time around family, around friends, in the rhythm of a life that was ordinary, in the best sense of the word. But that year, something started pulling at him. 10 years earlier, Michael had gone through a difficult divorce from his first wife. The split had been messy, the kind of divorce that leaves no clean lines, no good feelings, and a lot of distance between people who once shared a life. When it was finalized, his ex-wife had stayed in the family home in Sudbury, in the county of Suffolk, about an hour and a half north of London. Their daughter from that marriage, Lisa, who had been 21 at the time, had stayed with her mother. And Michael had gone south. And the years had passed. And now 10 of them were gone. He hadn't spoken to Lisa in a decade. He didn't have her phone number. He didn't know her address. He didn't even know where his ex-wife was anymore, which meant that route was closed too. Lisa had been 21 when he last saw her. She was 31 now. He had missed a significant portion of her adult life, and sitting with that fact in 2007, Michael found that he could no longer just let it sit. He talked to his wife. He talked to his 2 younger daughters. He told them he needed to find Lisa. Not wanted to, need to. And so they agreed. They would go to Sudbury and start from the only fixed point they still had, which was the address of the old family home. In August of that year, Michael and his 2 daughters loaded into the car and drove north to Sudbury. He found his old street. He parked in front of the house he had once lived in, got out alone, walked to the door, and knocked. A family he didn't recognize answered. They knew nothing about his ex-wife. They knew nothing about Lisa. They wished him luck and closed the door, and Michael walked back to the car carrying the particular weight of a plan that had already failed at the first step. The 3 of them drove around Sudbury for a while, half hoping they might simply spot Lisa on the street somewhere, knowing that was almost certainly not going to happen, and gradually arriving at a more practical idea. The local newspaper. If they could get a small feature placed in the Suffolk Free Press, a photo, a short write-up, Michael's contact information, a note explaining that he was looking for his daughter, maybe Lisa would see it. Maybe she still had connections to Sudbury. Maybe someone who knew her would pass it along. They drove to the paper's offices and went inside. A reporter listened to Michael's story and agreed it was worth a small feature. He and a photographer brought Michael and his daughters outside. The photographer positioned them on the pavement in front of the building and took the picture. Michael thanked them. He and his daughters got back in the car and drove home to East London. Now we need to follow Lisa. At the same time, Michael had been sitting in East London feeling the pull toward his first daughter. Lisa, now 31, married, a mother of 3, had been feeling the exact same pull in reverse. She had been thinking about her father, about the fact that her own children had a grandfather they had never met, about whether it was too late to do something about that. She had no way to reach him, no phone number, no address. She checked social media and found nothing. She asked her mother and her friends for ideas and came up with no clear path forward. Then, one afternoon in August, Lisa was in the break room at her office when she picked up a copy of the Suffolk Free Press that someone had left on the coffee table. She flipped through the pages. And then she stopped. Because she saw herself. There was a photograph in the paper taken somewhere in Sudbury, and in the background of that photograph was a woman who was clearly her, walking along the pavement. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier, visiting her mother, talking about strategies for finding her father, and then walking back through the town center to get to her car. She glanced at the caption. The 3 people in the foreground of that photograph, the man and the 2 girls who were the actual subject of the image, were her father and her 2 half-sisters. She just hadn't recognized them. She was looking at her own image in the background and hadn't yet processed that the strangers in the front were the people she had been looking for. For a moment, just breathe with that. On the one afternoon that Lisa was in Sudbury specifically to discuss how to find her father, she walked into the frame of the photograph her father was having taken for the purpose of finding her. 100 feet separated them on that pavement. They were walking in the same direction, in the same town, for the same reason, without knowing the other was there. And the photographer, who had no idea any of this was happening, pressed the shutter at exactly the moment that captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa read the article. She got her father's contact information. She called him. Michael's first reaction, reportedly, was that this was a scam. Someone had read the article, seen an opportunity, and was impersonating his daughter. It took some convincing. But eventually, he believed it was real, and he drove straight to Sudbury, and he met his grandchildren for the first time. Today, Michael and Lisa are still in contact. There is no explanation for why the photographer took the shot at that precise second. There is no explanation for why Lisa happened to be in Sudbury on that particular day. There is no explanation for why, out of all the days and all the streets and all the windows and all the copies of a local newspaper sitting on coffee tables across that part of England, these 2 people found each other through a single accidental image in a free weekly paper. But here is the detail that stays with me longest. Lisa had gone to Sudbury specifically to talk to her mother about strategies for finding her father. That was the purpose of the trip. She was sitting in her mother's house, probably at a kitchen table, probably with a cup of something warm, working through the problem of how to locate someone who had moved on and left no trail. And then she walked back through the town center to get to her car. Mike, someone at that same moment, was standing in front of the offices of the local paper, being photographed for the article that was supposed to solve the exact same problem from his direction. They were not just in the same town. They were both actively in the middle of searching. Both of them mid-effort, mid-plan, mid-hope. And neither knew the other was there 100 feet behind them doing the same thing from the other side. When Lisa eventually called Michael and convinced him it was real, and he drove to Sudbury to meet her, there would have been a moment, some moment in that first meeting, maybe over a meal, maybe standing on a doorstep, where someone said, "We were there at the same time." We were that close. And neither of us knew. What do you do with that? There's no clean emotional response to it. There is grief in it. 10 years of distance, of not knowing, of children growing up without grandparents, and a father without his daughter. There is also something that feels almost like a joke the universe is telling, except the punchline is one you actually wanted. They were looking for each other. They were right there. A photograph caught what neither of them could see. Sometimes the universe just gets it right. And sometimes it lets you see the evidence afterward. In the final semester of his college education in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry signed up for an acting class because he thought it would be easy. He was shy by nature and figured the class might help him come out of himself a little. He expected to sit in a room, read some lines, get his grade, and move on. Instead, two things happened. He met the woman who would become his wife. And he discovered, to his genuine surprise, that he actually loved acting. When he graduated, Harry and his new wife made the decision that most people who feel that particular love decide to make. They went to Hollywood. He auditioned for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, a pipeline designed to give new actors and actresses a foot in the door at a time when getting any foothold in Hollywood was nearly impossible. He was accepted. He signed a contract that paid him almost nothing. And the program immediately began sending him out for parts. Nobody wanted Harry. This is not a cruel summary, it's what happened. Month after month, the only roles that materialized were minor and non-speaking. The kind of roles that don't advance a career. The kind that fills out a crowd scene. After 2 years of this, in 1966, something changed. Harry was offered a speaking role in an actual film. Not a lead. Not a supporting part. A 60-second scene where he played a bellhop in a hotel, walked on screen, called out for a guest, found the guest, handed him a piece of paper, and left. Forgettable. But real. A real scene in a real movie with real lines that he actually got to say. Harry went to the studio and filmed it. He thought it went well. He came back to the New Talent Program offices afterward, and before he'd barely gotten through the door, one of the producers in charge of the program called him over and asked him to come upstairs. They sat down. The producer told him he had seen the scene. And then he told Harry directly and without much warmth that he was not going to make it in Hollywood. He said, when Tony Curtis carried groceries across a room in one of his first movies, everyone watching knew immediately that man was going to be a star. You could see something in him even when he was doing nothing. When you walked around as that bellhop, I didn't see it. You don't have it. You are not going to be a movie star. Harry sat there for a moment. Then he leaned forward and said, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star? The producer fired him on the spot. Harry signed a similar deal with Universal Studios. Universal's feedback was slightly different in its wording, but identical in its conclusion. Not pretty enough, not talented enough, no future here. By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s. He still wanted to act, that hadn't changed. The love of it hadn't gone anywhere, but he was making almost nothing from it. He had a wife. He had 2 sons. He needed money. And so he made a decision that had nothing to do with any particular aptitude and everything to do with necessity. He would become a carpenter. He checked out every how-to book on carpentry he could find at the library. He practiced. He did projects around his own house. And then, when he felt either sufficiently confident or sufficiently desperate, he started calling people in his network and asking if anyone needed woodworking done. Hollywood, it turned out, had a surprising number of people who needed woodworking done, and before long, Harry had built up enough of a client base that someone gave him a name, the Carpenter to the Stars. Which was, as he would later acknowledge himself, somewhat ironic, given that he was frequently spotted on job sites holding a carpentry manual in one hand while doing the actual carpentry with the other. In 1976, Harry had been a full-time carpenter for about a year when one of his closest friends, a man named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, called him with what he described as an opportunity. Harry was not interested. He said so directly. He had accepted, more or less, that acting was behind him. He had a family to support, a business that was working, and no desire to go back into rooms where people told him he wasn't good enough. Fred told him this was different. This wasn't a standard audition. This was a situation where a very specific, very unusual director needed one more person for an audition session, and the person was not being asked to actually try out for anything. He would just sit in the room, read lines so the real candidates could deliver their performances against someone, and that was it. The director, who was known for running group auditions so he could assess chemistry and dynamic in real time, was short one male actor because someone had dropped out last minute. Fred had volunteered Harry to fill the slot. Harry pointed out, not incorrectly, that this sounded like a waste of an afternoon. Fred acknowledged that it might be. But he also pointed out that this director was becoming a significant figure in Hollywood and that the other people in that room were going to be people worth knowing, even if nothing came of the acting. Worst case, Harry walked away with a couple of potential carpentry clients and an afternoon out of the house. Fred said, "Just go. Read the lines. Don't try to act. They told me specifically he's there to facilitate the audition, not to participate in it. Just go." Harry went. He was handed the script. He was reminded more than once that he was not auditioning. Just read the lines. Monotone was fine. The other people in the room were the ones being evaluated. He was furniture. And so Harry sat there, bored, slightly irritated at having been voluntold into this situation, not performing for anyone, and just reading, being himself. Which, as it turned out, meant coming across as a grumpy, sarcastic, somewhat alpha man who didn't particularly care what anyone in the room thought of him. Because he didn't. He was only there because Fred had essentially guilt-tripped him into it, and he wasn't pretending otherwise. This, as it turned out, was exactly the quality that the director had been trying to find in one of the central characters of the film he was casting. That specific gravity, that particular kind of man who seems like he's not performing for anyone because he isn't. Nobody told Harry what was happening. He read the lines all day, decided at the end of the session that he could now throw the script in the trash and never think about this again, and was on his way out when the director walked up to him. The director's name was George Lucas. The man he had been watching all day, the man who thought he was just there to read lines and go home, was Harrison Ford. And George Lucas said, "I was wrong. You are perfect for this. I need you to play Han Solo." Harrison Ford said yes. The rest of that story is a matter of record. Star Wars was released in 1977 and became one of the most successful films in cinema history. Harrison Ford went from a carpenter who kept books in his tool belt to one of the most recognizable actors alive. A few years after all of this, after Star Wars, after the sequels, after Harrison Ford had become the kind of name people recognized everywhere, he was having lunch at a restaurant on a Hollywood studio lot when a waiter approached with a silver tray. On the tray was a single business card. The waiter set it down and walked away. Harrison picked up the card and flipped it over. On one side, written by hand, were 3 words, "I missed my bet." On the other side was the name of the producer from the new talent program, the one who had called Harry into his office in 1966, told him he had no future, and fired him on the spot. The man was apparently in the same restaurant, had spotted Harrison across the room, and had sent over that card as an acknowledgement. A concession. An olive branch, maybe, or just an honest admission from someone who had been spectacularly wrong? Harrison Ford would later say in interviews that the moment he understood what he was looking at the card, the message, the implication that this producer was somewhere in that room watching him, he scanned the room once, couldn't pick the man out because he genuinely had no idea what he looked like, decided he wasn't going to waste any more time looking, set the card down on the table, and went back to his lunch. He didn't need to find the man. The card said everything. There are people who appear to exist slightly outside the normal rules. Michael Packard is one of them. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was on a small plane over Costa Rica when it crashed. The pilot, co-pilot, and 1 passenger were killed on impact. Michael and 4 other passengers survived badly, injured, stranded in a remote section of jungle with no road access and no way to know whether the distress signal they were sending from the wreckage was reaching anyone. They waited 48 hours. Rescuers found them. A doctor at the hospital where Michael was treated told him afterward that based on his injuries, he would not have survived another night in the jungle. The odds of being in a plane crash at all, depending on your source, sit somewhere between 1 in 5 million and 1 in 20 million. To be in one, to survive it, and to be told you had one night left, that alone is a story most people would carry for the rest of their lives. Michael carried it and kept moving. Over the following 2 decades, Michael, who worked as a commercial diver and spent most of his professional life in the water off the coast of California and later Massachusetts, would survive not 1, but 2 significant encounters with great white sharks. He would get lost at sea on open water, treading in the middle of the ocean with no land visible in any direction for hours before a boat found him. He would discover the body of a long-missing person submerged roughly 60 feet below the surface off the coast of Massachusetts. Each of these, on its own, would be a defining moment for most people. For Michael Packard, they appear to be something closer to recurring themes. But of everything that has happened to Michael Packard, nothing compares to the morning of the 11th of June 2021. He was 57 years old. He and his longtime diving partner Josiah loaded their equipment into a boat and headed out from the shore of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The plan was lobster diving, a method that involves going down to the seafloor by hand and retrieving lobsters without any cage or trap system. Just a diver, the bottom of the ocean, and whatever happens to be down there. They reached their spot just after 6 in the morning. Josiah stayed in the boat. Michael suited up, checked his equipment, gave the signal, and went under. The first few dives produced a modest haul. Not the best day for lobsters, they agreed, but not nothing. By 8 in the morning, Michael had brought up approximately 100 pounds of lobsters. A decent morning. They decided he'd go down once more, one final dive, and then they'd call it and head back. Michael put his mouthpiece back in, gave the thumbs up, disappeared below the surface. Josiah watched the water. It was calm, quiet. And then, from somewhere below where Michael had gone down, the surface erupted a violent churning of white water shooting upward like something enormous had moved very fast just beneath it. Josiah leaned over the edge of the boat and looked down. He could see something large moving below. He could not see Michael. What had happened, as Michael would describe it later, was this. He had descended to around 45 feet, not yet at the bottom, still working his way down, when something struck him from behind with enough force that his entire body was thrown sideways and everything around him went instantly black. The impact knocked the mouthpiece out of his mouth. He was now 45 feet below the surface with no air supply, in complete darkness, and he immediately began reaching for the line connected to his mouthpiece so he could get it back. But as his hands moved through the dark space around him, they found walls. Soft walls that were also somehow firm, walls that were warm, walls that seemed to pulse and flex. He was enclosed. He was inside something. The space was relatively large enough that he wasn't immediately compressed, but it was not still. It was moving and moving fast, and the water inside it was sloshing violently against every surface. He kept reaching for the mouthpiece line. He found it. He jammed it into his mouth and inhaled. And with air back in his lungs, he had his first coherent thought. Has a shark swallowed me? He reached for teeth, feeling along the inner walls for the thing that would confirm his worst assumption. But there were no teeth. Only those shifting, pulsing walls. And then the pressure concentrated specifically on his legs intensified. That was when he understood. He had been swallowed by a humpback whale. Not a shark. A humpback. An animal that can reach 60 feet in length and 70,000 pounds in weight, and that survives entirely on small fish and krill, which meant that what was currently clamped around Michael's legs was the whale's mouth, and the whale was in the process of trying to figure out what it had accidentally collected. For approximately 45 seconds, Michael Packard was inside the closed mouth of a living humpback whale, 45 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. When the whale registered that this was not a small fish, it began shaking its head hard, back and forth to dislodge whatever it had taken in. That motion was what Josiah saw from the boat, the eruption of white water at the surface as an animal the size of a school bus thrashed its head to get rid of the thing in its mouth. After several seconds of this, Michael was expelled. He came out into open water with enough ambient light filtering down that he could see around him. The water was turbulent and disorienting. He looked down. Directly below him, the tail of the whale slid through his field of vision as the animal swam away, apparently unconcerned. Michael made it to the surface. Josiah pulled him into the boat. The first thing Michael managed to say was that he had been inside it, and that it had tried to eat him. He was taken to shore and transported to a hospital where he was evaluated. The extent of his injuries, significant bruising on his legs where the whale's mouth had been closing, no broken bones, no internal damage. No respiratory complications despite having spent the better part of a minute without consistent air supply at depth. He was discharged that afternoon. In interviews afterward, Michael Packard spoke about being swallowed by a whale with a kind of settled calm that suggested either profound equanimity or a complete recalibration of what counts as unusual. Reporters asked him how he felt, what he would do differently, whether he was going to stop diving. He said he was going back in the water as soon as he was able. Experts estimated the probability of a human being accidentally swallowed by a humpback whale, taken alive into the closed mouth of a living cetacean, and then expelled at approximately 1 in 1 trillion. Michael Packard had already survived a plane crash, 2 great white shark encounters, and being lost at sea. The ocean has tried to keep him 4 times. He keeps coming home. On the evening of the 6th of January, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, an area sitting just west of Denver along the edge of the Rocky Mountains, arrived at Denver International Airport running late. A snowstorm had been working over the Denver metro area for most of the day, and the drive-in had been slow and treacherous. Harold had made it, but barely. He checked in, cleared security, and reached his gate just as boarding had begun. He filed into the queue, found his seat at the front right side of the plane, buckled in, picked up the in-flight magazine from the seat pocket in front of him, and waited. 15 minutes later, the plane began its roll down the runway and lifted into the night. Harold looked out the window. Denver at night from the air is a grid of amber and white light, spreading east across the plains and pressing west against the dark wall of the Front Range. Harold knew this view well. He spent enough time in Jefferson County to know the geography below him without needing a map. And so as the plane climbed and banked west, he tracked the landscape. The city, the suburbs, the black mass of open land before the mountains began. And then something in the dark caught his eye. Cutting through the Rockies directly west of Jefferson County was a stretch of road called the Guanella Pass, 22 miles of switchbacks climbing over an 11,000-foot mountain crossing. In summer, it was a scenic drive. In winter, it was closed. Not advisable, not discouraged, closed. The road was not maintained once the snow came, and the combination of elevation, grade, and exposure made it impassable for any vehicle that didn't belong there. From the window of the ascending plane, Harold could see headlights on the Guanella Pass. In a snowstorm, at night, on a road that was supposed to have no one on it. He leaned toward the window and looked harder. The headlights weren't moving. The vehicle was stationary. And then he saw it, a light extending out from one of the windows, flashing upward into the sky. On, off, on, off. Deliberate. Rhythmic. The unmistakable signal of someone who needed help and was trying to be seen. Harold understood, in a way that required no deliberation, what he was looking at. He also understood that the probability of another plane flying over that particular section of mountains at that hour and having someone on board who recognized what they were seeing was essentially zero. If he sat back down, put the magazine in front of his face, and let the plane continue on its way, that person on the Guanella Pass would not be found until it was too late. It was negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit on that mountain that night. Harold got up, climbed over the person in the seat next to him, found a flight attendant in the aisle and explained quickly and clearly what he had seen and what he believed it meant. The attendant took him seriously. They went to the cockpit. The pilots got on the radio. 15 minutes later, the fire department had been dispatched to the Guanella Pass. He found a small pickup truck buried nose first in a snowbank, engine running, headlights still on. The man inside was named Alan Phillips, 30 years old, a mechanic from the Denver area. He was wearing a light jacket and jeans. He had a small blanket pulled around him. He had been there long enough that the cold had become something beyond discomfort, moving into the early territory of hypothermia. When Dave reached his window, Alan was crying before Dave had even introduced himself. Dave asked what had happened. Alan told him he'd had a few drinks at a bar and decided to drive home through the Guanella Pass, forgetting or not fully accounting for the fact that the road was not maintained in winter. He'd lost traction not far in and slid off the road into the snowbank. He'd tried to free the truck. Couldn't. So he'd done the only thing he could think of. Grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the sky and hoped that someone somewhere might see it and understand. Dave asked about the deep bruise on Alan's cheek. Alan, in a moment of sheepish honesty, explained that after getting stuck, he had needed to step outside to relieve himself. He walked a few feet from the truck. When he turned to walk back, the blowing snow was so dense that he couldn't see the truck. He panicked and ran directly into the door of his own vehicle, face first. Dave told him he was one lucky man. He was not wrong, just not in the way either of them understood. The story ran in local papers over the following days. Some national outlets picked it up. The miracle at Guanella Pass. A sheriff on a plane, a flashlight in a snowstorm, an improbable rescue at 11,000 feet. It had everything a feel-good story needed. Harold Bray, the unlikely hero who happened to look out the right window. Alan Phillips, the shaken survivor who had made a stupid decision and nearly paid for it with his life. Dave Montoya and the fire department, who had driven a four-wheel drive into a blizzard in the middle of the night because someone passed a message down from a plane. The whole thing read like something that was meant to happen. Like the story was pointing somewhere good. That headline did not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan Phillips to two unsolved murders that had occurred on the same night he got stuck on the Guanella Pass. Earlier that evening, several hours before his truck slid off the road, Alan had picked up a 22-year-old woman named Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking in an area near Breen Ridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the pass. She got into the truck. Based on what investigators believe happened next, Alan produced a weapon, restrained her with zip-tie handcuffs, drove to a remote location, walked her into the woods, and shot her in the back. Her body was found face down in a stream. A couple of hours later, Alan picked up a second hitchhiker, a 29-year-old woman named Barbara Oberholzer. She got into the truck. He restrained her the same way. But Barbara broke free of her restraints. She struck Alan in the face, the blow that left that deep bruise on his cheek that he gave Dave Montoya such an embarrassed little smile about. She threw open the door of the moving truck and ran. Alan stopped the truck, got out, chased her down, shot her in the chest. He pushed her body off the side of a cliff into the snowbank below. And then he got back in his truck and drove toward the Guanella Pass, heading for the mountains, trying to put miles between himself and what he had done. He didn't know the road was closed. Or he didn't care. Either way, he didn't make it far before the truck went sideways on the ice and buried itself in the snowbank. And so he sat there in the dark, in the cold, a man who had just killed two women and was now going to die of exposure on a mountain in a snowstorm, and he did the one thing he could think of. He pointed a flashlight at the sky. And Harold Bray, a sheriff in Jefferson County, happened to look out his window at the right moment, from the right angle, at the right altitude, and saw it. In February of 2021, Alan Phillips, 70 years old at the time, still living in the Denver area, was arrested for both murders. Annette Schnee and Barbara Oberholzer had been dead hours of 38 years before anyone was charged with killing them. The rescue and the crime exist on the same night. The same flashlight. The same snowbank. The same man. One moment was described as a miracle. The other was not. The odds of Harold Bray being on that plane at that altitude, looking out that window at that exact second, the odds are nearly incalculable. Just like the odds of being swallowed by a whale. Just like the odds of finding your daughter in the background of a photograph you didn't know she was in, the difference is what the odds were in service of. Just after midnight on the 22nd of June 1991, a man named Charles Holden was on his way home from work in Harrington, Delaware, when he stopped at a fast food restaurant near his house. He ate. He got back into his truck. He started the engine. He was about to pull out of the lot when he saw a man jogging toward him from across the parking lot, waving him down. Charles stopped. He rolled down his window. The man said his sister was having a baby. He needed a ride to the hospital about 20 minutes away. He was asking for help. Charles looked at him. It was past midnight. He didn't know this man. And something about the interaction felt off in a way that Charles couldn't articulate but also couldn't dismiss. The feeling you get sometimes when your body registers something before your mind catches up. He said no. Too late, too far out of his way, he needed to get home. The man's face fell. He turned and walked away. Charles watched him go. And then he felt bad. There's a particular discomfort in watching someone walk away who has just asked you for something, even if you have good reasons for saying no. Charles sat there for a moment with that discomfort. Then he called out to the man and told him to come back. He'd take him part of the way. The man got in. They drove in the direction of the hospital. After about 3 miles, Charles pulled over on the side of the road and told the man this was as far as he was going. He lived only a block away, and he wasn't going to drive further from home at this hour of the night. The man in the passenger seat went quiet. Then he went angry. His hand went into his pocket. He started screaming, "Give him the keys, give him the wallet, hand everything over right now or he was going to kill him." Charles didn't deliberate. He turned off the truck, ripped the keys from the ignition, shoved open his door, and ran. Off in the distance, he could see a convenience store, lights still on. He ran for it. But when he turned and looked behind him, the man had gotten out and was running too fast, gaining a screwdriver raised in his hand. Charles ran the math. He wasn't going to make the store. He stopped, turned around, raised his hands. He told the man, "Okay, get back in the truck. I'll drive you wherever you want to go. You can have my keys, my wallet, everything. Just let's get back to the truck." The man smiled. He prodded Charles forward with the screwdriver. They walked back to the vehicle, together with Charles in front, the man directly behind him, screwdriver periodically touching his back. Charles got to the driver's side door. The man told him to get in and wait. Charles got in, started the engine, and drove. He floored it. He looked in the mirror as he accelerated away and watched the man standing in the road behind him, screaming, screwdriver raised above his head, and then receding until he was too small to make out, and then gone. Charles drove for a while. He breathed. He thought about calling the police, but talked himself out of it. This had been his decision, letting a stranger into his truck at midnight, and he felt implicated in his own near robbery in a way that made him not want to make that call. What he was concerned about was geography. He had ditched this man not far from his house. If the man had noticed the neighborhood, had any sense of where Charles lived, he could be there waiting. So rather than going straight home, Charles drove around outside of town for about an hour, letting time pass, letting the situation settle. At the end of that hour, he came back into Harrington and turned onto his street. The man was right there, walking along the road in front of his house as if he had been waiting, as if he knew exactly where Charles lived. Charles hit the brakes without thinking, threw the truck into reverse, and got out of there. He called 911 from a payphone. An officer came to him and escorted him back to his property. The man was gone by the time they arrived. There was no sign of a break-in. No sign of anyone having been near the house. Charles felt the relief spread through him as he stood in his own yard, breathing cold air, grateful that what had been a terrifying night was over. He thanked the officer and then, almost as an afterthought, asked him a favor. His mother lived directly behind him, on the other side of a row of bushes at the back of his property. Dorothy, 70 years old, living alone. Charles asked if the officer wouldn't mind doing a quick check on her, just to confirm everything was okay on her side of the fence. The officer said, "Of course." He went across the backyard, through the bushes, into Dorothy's yard. The back window beside the door was shattered. The door itself was slightly open. The officer drew his weapon and went inside. Dorothy was upstairs. She had been stabbed to death. The man's name was Gilbert Cannon. After Charles drove away from him the second time, Gilbert had needed somewhere to sleep. He walked through the neighborhood and found a house that looked accessible. He broke in through the back door. Dorothy came down the stairs to confront the intruder. Gilbert was afraid she could identify him. He attacked her with the screwdriver he had been carrying all night. He had no idea that the house he had broken into belonged to the mother of the man he had tried to rob an hour earlier. The entire chain of events, the fast food restaurant, the late-night ride, the robbery attempt, the foot chase, the escape, the hour of driving around outside of town, the return to the neighborhood, the police escort home, and the discovery of Dorothy's body a matter of feet from where Charles was standing was, as Gilbert Cannon would later tell police, completely random. He didn't know Charles. He had picked the truck in the parking lot on impulse. After the robbery failed, he had picked the house on impulse. None of it was designed. There was no plan that threaded these two lives together. It just happened. Gilbert Cannon pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Charles Holden gave a stranger a partial ride home because he felt bad about saying no. And his mother paid for it. There is no framework that contains that. No way to resolve it into something meaningful or instructive or fair. Some things are not coincidences in the beautiful sense, they are collisions, accidents of proximity, two people arriving at the same terrible place through paths that had nothing to do with each other, except that they did. Except that Charles made a choice at a fast food counter at midnight. Except that Gilbert picked that truck and not a different one. If Charles had said no and meant it, if he hadn't felt that pull of guilt when the man turned and walked away, Gilbert never gets in that truck, never ends up in that neighborhood, never finds that house. Dorothy is alive the next morning. The distance between the ending this story had and the ending it might have had is one moment of second guessing. One small act of decency toward a stranger in a parking lot. 5 stories. A father and a daughter walking 100 feet apart, caught in the same photograph on the same afternoon in the same town where they were both searching for each other. A man who went to an audition as furniture and came home as Han Solo. A man who has been inside a plane crash, great white shark encounters, open ocean and a whale's mouth, and who keeps going back in the water because that's who he is. A sheriff who looked out a window at the right second and saved the wrong man. And a good Samaritan who gave someone a lift and lost his mother before the night was over. What connects them is not luck. Not exactly. What connects them is something harder to name, the fact that ordinary moments carry consequences that are wildly disproportionate to how they feel at the time. Michael Dick didn't know he was standing 100 feet from his daughter. Harrison Ford didn't know he was auditioning. Harold Bray didn't know what Alan Phillips had done 2 hours earlier. Charles Holden didn't know that the guilt he felt when a stranger turned and walked away would matter more than anything else that happened that night. They were just people in ordinary moments, making ordinary choices. And the universe arranged around those moments something enormous in one direction or another. The photograph finds you. The director notices. The ocean eventually lets you go. The flashlight gets seen. The stranger gets in. Most of the time, we will never know which of our ordinary moments carried the most weight. We don't get to see the photograph until it's already been taken. We don't find out about the open audition until we're already in the room. We can't know, Standing in a fast food parking lot at midnight, watching someone walk away, whether the thing we're about to decide will change everything. We just make the call. And then we find out what it meant. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories like these, there are hundreds of them here on this channel. And if you want one recommendation from me, one video that's worth your time right now, it's this one right here. Until next time.